Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto messes up and ends up in an alternate universe where his parents are still alive. Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. After the war there will be none sane. After the war there will be only pain that ripples through the bodies of soldiers who won't understand the rain. After the war there will be only one. After the war there will be only he that will scream out the names of the precious who won't understand his flee. The Rockudame wasn't sure how he ended up in the small confines of his old office. He had no memory as to how he wandered into the village, but somehow he did. He stepped over the rubble and the debris. He had somehow been able to keep the bile from rising in his throat as he walked past the burnt bodies and the dried blood that spread in the weeds and on the concrete. It had been beyond his knowledge as to how he had been able to look over the good memories of his old village without crying. The bile had risen in his throat and he pushed it down as he scrutinized his broken village to the core. He couldn't help but take the blame for the way it stood now. A frown etched onto his face. He bit his lip as he tried to keep the tears from rolling down his cheeks. He had successfully drawn blood. He hadn't cried since after the war and he wouldn't cry again. Suddenly, beyond his control, his tears streamed down his face and snot ran down his nose. He cried out as his heart felt like it was being clenched by rough cold hands. His legs trembled as he looked over his village, the village he had sworn to protect and the village he failed to protect. "Kid," a gruff voice called out to him and he quickly straightened himself up. He wiped his tears and snot on the sleeve of his Hokage coat. He took in a deep breath and closed his eyes as he entered his mindscape and opened his eyes when the cool temperature of the sower of his mindscape kissed his cheek. He walked over towards the voice of his mindscape, the only friend he had left. Because of the fox he had been able to stay alive. He felt honored and very guilty at the same time. He made his way towards a door and he slowly opened it to find a bright white room. Little bits of chakra floated around the room and when they reached him they entered into him making a weird warmth form in his chest. The fox lay his head on his paws and a soft sound came from the creature. Although it seemed he was asleep he was awake. His crimson eyes looked over Naruto and a small piece of him wanted to be able to do something about his sadness. He couldn't though. He wasn't one who gave comfort and he never really mourned any human sadness as he did Naruto's. He contemplated telling the kid that he could fix the situation and help him. He didn't know if Naruto would be able to take the physical pain that it would take. He didn't even know if he himself could take the physical pain that this action would cause. However, he knew it would fix things, it would help the Rockudame. He sighed. "I know how to fix this." A smile, a very faint smile spread on the Rockudame's lips and the fox felt like snarling. The smile represented question and for some reason, the kid was questioning him. His eyebrows quirked up and his eyes lit up with confusion and unease. This wasn't the kid and Naruto knew it himself. He was slowly dying from his depression and the fox was going to help the kid one way or another, whether he wanted it or not. When Naruto gave no objections, the demon then allowed his chakra to seep into him and the kid stiffened a bit. It had been a while since he went into tailed beast mode. He honestly seemed a bit frantic at first. He had not felt that way since he was 16, it felt oddly warm and he allowed his body to accept the chakra that was seeping into his body and creating a cloak around his normal ninja attire. With no objections he closed his eyes and entered the real world again. The power that seeped into him made his small smile grow into a grin. He heard the Kyuubi's plan and he couldn't help it. He'd be able to change everything after this. He'd be able to save his village, his precious people. He opened his eyes, he could feel the nature around him come to life. He could hear the birds and he could hear the water flow. He could feel the trees grow slowly in his country and soon the determination that he hadn't had in a long while returned. "So how are we going to do this, Kyuubi?" The excitement was oozing out of his voice and he could not contain the sheer amount of energy that replaced his gloomy aura. The creature inside him did not detest Naruto's excitement even though in the past he most likely would have. His idea was very well thought out, the plan, besides minor complications, was perfect and most likely couldn't be derailed. However high the chance of success was though didn't mean that the blonde would be able to survive the journey he had suggested. However, the fierce fox demon was not about to die and he wasn't about to tell the kid that they could die. "Now, listen up and sit down." The demon blonde never really listened to Kyuubi's rambling as he called it. Of course he never listened because the kid would be so wrapped up in his own thoughts that after the Kyuubi finished his ramblings, they'd be at death's door within the next second. Even though the Rockudame had been known for thriving under pressure, it was a whole different story with what the Kyuubi had suggested. They weren't fighting an enemy, hell Kyuubi had no clue what they were fighting, but it was eating his host alive. As the Rockudame calmed down a small but noticeable frown was on his face. He never did any good listening to the fox, however. He'd listen now since every other time he didn't he'd almost end up dead. He took a seat as the fox ordered, stretching out his legs and leaning against his desk that was somehow still standing. First you have to know doing this can change you physically. It could alter your appearance, so don't freak out, however it most likely won't happen. If you're going to do this, then there are some other things you need to know. First, this is a warp ceiling. You remember when Himori taught you that, right? The blonde thought on the question. It had been a long time since he'd seen Himori, however. He did remember her teaching him seals and calligraphy. He nodded his head and a relieved sigh came from inside him. Good, good. It will be that kind of seal. I hope you have that seal with you, kid, a sigh emitted from the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki. The Rakudane didn't believe he had it as he rummaged through his pouch on his right leg, to his surprise, though he got out the small sealing paper. I got it. He indicated this by pointing towards the seal and grinning like a madman. The fox only rolled his eyes, but his own small smile spread on his face. He didn't know how this was going to work out exactly, but if they survived it sure as hell was going to be interesting. Alright kid, here is what you need to do. The next hour had passed by very slowly for the bored Rakudame. He had been leaning on his desk fixing the warp seal that he had. It was very complex and the design was beyond what he had achieved in his few years as a Fuinjutsu master, however he did it. It had taken him over 15 minutes to make some ink and he had used some random piece of wood for fixing the seal. He had then spent 45 minutes getting the seal right. He placed the small seal in his pouch again as he stood up and stretched out. I better head back to camp and pack my stuff. He muttered to himself. When he made his way out of the office he kept his eyes on the newly grown trees. It had been some time since he had planted those trees there. It seemed that now those trees wouldn't be needed. He'd fix things soon enough. On his journey to camp the Rakudane was a bit anxious and excited. He also felt as if the fox hadn't told him something that would be important for him to determine if he really wanted to do this. He put off asking because it didn't matter. He had a chance and he was going to take it. He traveled closer and closer to his camp. You could see the tent he had set up along with his sleeping bag. He halted and gathered his things together. He took his scrolls and his kunes which had seals on them. He took his money and some food rations. He then looked over the camp again and stumbled upon a picture. His breath had gotten stuck on his throat and he could feel the tears brim in his eyes. He wiped them away quickly and took the picture, gazing at all of the faces of his precious people. I promise, I'll make things right this time. Everything will be better. He mumbled to himself. He could feel the snort that the fox had made, but Naruto ignored it. He took out the small seal and then went on to do hand signs, not knowing that he messed up on one particular sign. He bit his thumb and pressed it onto the middle of the seal. The blinding red light engulfed him and he felt pain shoot up his body. Shit, what the hell did you do, kid? The demon snapped as he felt a pain like no other. It surged all around his body and he howled out loud. The fox felt as if he was going to be ripped to pieces. The Rakudane growled as he felt pain crawl all along his skin. It was as if he was burning and soon he saw his was. His skin was begging to detach itself from his flesh and bone. He grit his teeth and looked on in horror for a while before his vision became a blur and he shut his eyes closed and he drifted within the red light until he was nowhere to be seen within the light. After what felt like hours of agonizing pain, he opened his eyes to see the bright sun greet him. Green grass surrounded him along with many of sunflowers that sprung up high. He could only gaze at the beautiful flowers. He tried his hardest to move his bruised body, but he was unsuccessful. Naruto felt vulnerable and he couldn't take the stillness of his body, however depressed he had been before he had never stopped moving. Now was a different story though. He had no choice but to yield to the pain that had enveloped his body. He moaned in pain as he watched the sunflowers dance in the breeze. He waited and waited until he had heard soft footsteps on the grass and sunflowers. His hope spiked up to all-time high and he glanced around to look for the owner of the footsteps. An older woman looked over him with wide eyes. Naruto couldn't take the pain anymore and when the woman began to ask him questions and call for help, he closed his eyes and entered into a black abyss. The patterns of life are soft like ashes. We come and we go like the illness that bounds us to the world we wished was ours and to close the doors that carry our scars. Soft fingers stroked his forehead as he felt himself coming to. He heard voices and tried his hardest to determine who they were, however they were muffled. He furrowed his brows and opened his eyes to see the blurry figure that was stroking his head. She was in the normal Konohagakure nursing attire. Her hair was a dark brown color that could be mistaken for black, it went down to her dot. Her eyes were also brown. She was looking up to someone saying something. His vision and hearing became clearer as she looked down at him with wide eyes. She slowly got up and began to order whoever else was in the room. Go and call for them. Her voice was familiar and he peeked at her face, his eyes trying to figure out who she was. She turned her attention back to him and smiled generously. She sat beside him where she was only a few seconds ago and when he got a better look at her he felt like gasping. She was one of his precious people. Someone he thought he'd never see again. Shizune looked very different with longer hair and without her pig, Tun. He wondered if she believed he looked different too. She had died during the war, trying her hardest to save people that needed medical attention. He looked over at her and wondered if he had died. She looked no different, she only had longer hair. He frowned at her. "Hello," she said softly, and then she began to stroke his forehead with her thumb again. It was a very soothing gesture, and he even closed his eyes for a moment before returning her greeting. "Hi," he stopped midway as he was about to say her name. He touched his throat and gave Shizune a questioning look. His voice was not his own. Instead it was the voice of a kid. He looked around frantically but caught himself. Luckily Shizune didn't catch his slight panic attack since she was looking at his IV. She glanced over at him and gave him a warm smile. "How about we tell each other about ourselves?" she proposed. He looked at her a bit funny. He already knew who she was. Why would he need to know that information again? The light bulb then popped up at the top of his head and quickly nodded his head to her proposal. Had the Kyuubi's plan actually worked, was he in the past, and if so how far and when? He then thought back to what the long-haired Shizune had said. She had told the nurse to get someone. Who could it be? Why would she call for anyone? If he was in the past, then who could she call? He had no parents and no guardian. Well then, let's do the icebreaker. Naruto gave her another questioning look. What exactly was an icebreaker? Didn't she just say that he should tell her about himself? "I'll tell you about me and you'll say some things about yourself. So how about we start with me?" Shizune said, even though she didn't know it, she had pulled Naruto out of his thoughts. He nodded and listened to her talk about herself. She talked about her interest and other things that he wasn't paying attention to. If he had been successful in time traveling, then why did he sound like a kid? Did it alter his body too? What else was different about him? Did he look different? He most likely didn't, but he couldn't take that out of consideration. The Kyuubi had said that some things might be different about him. He wanted so bad to go into his mindscape and demand answers from the prisoner inside him. Naruto returned his attention to the long-haired Shizune. "Alright, tell me about." A loud knock came from the door and you could hear soft whispers outside. Shizune got up and patted his head. She gave him a warm smile and turned on her heels to answer the door. More questions raced in his mind, however he decided he'd question the beast within him. He had learned to communicate with the Kyuubi without going into his mind, however the only downside to it was that he could only talk out loud. He cursed himself. He'd been alone for so long he forgot that it wasn't exactly normal to be seen talking to yourself or the demon inside you. He frowned as he decided to take the chance. "Kyuubi," he whispered as he heard the door open. Something like a shower curtain was hiding Naruto's face, so he was okay. He heard more whispers outside as he waited for an answer. "Did I know you have questions, but I can't answer them right now. Just wait it out." Naruto could only shake his head in understanding. He had put himself in a situation that would make him look like a lunatic. And if this was the past, then that meant most wouldn't know who he was, and he didn't want to give a weird impression of himself. Yeah, he could be awkward, but he didn't want to seem like a total psycho. He held in his breath as he began to eavesdrop on the conversation just outside the curtain. It was obvious that they were all good ninja because their stealth skills were amazing. He couldn't hear anything they said and decided not to mess with his chakra just to hear their conversation. From what he knew, he was in a child's body. He didn't know if the child's body he was in would be capable of doing that. Footsteps were heard as he saw Shizune direct some people into his room. The IT agent looked over the curtain to see the child he was after. "Please come with us, boy." Ibiki looked over the child with a warm and gentle smile on his face, however he did not stop his eyes from dancing in a menacing way. The impostor who was posing as the fourth Hokage's son sat in his bed in silence. He looked over at the IT-net, then at Ibiki's assistant, Inoichi. The Yamanaka looked very disturbed and Ibiki couldn't say that cared to find out a reason. He knew that Inoichi had a daughter who knew the Yandame's son. He knew that Inoichi had even had a bond, if that's what you would call it, with the fourth Hokage's son. However, this was not the Hokage's son, so had no idea why the Yamanaka had his brows furrowed and his lips in a frown. The blonde-haired boy gave them an uneasy glance as he scratched his cheek. He got out of the hospital bed. Ibiki could tell the boy was in pain, however he kept a stoic look on his face the whole time. He mentally grinned at the observation. The boy was ninja. Like any other person that tried to impersonate the Yandame's son, which was none, the sadistic IT agent would always be more than happy to put the bastard in his place. He knew how much the Yandame loved his son, and after the tragic incident on October 10th, a phony henge like the one the blonde was masking himself in would be given no mercy for bringing back those memories. However, he would lead the blonde into thinking that he believed that the boy was the Yandame's son. However, Ibiki would have to credit him. The spy, or whatever the hell the ninja was trying to be, was very talented in getting into secured areas, and that meant very secured places such as Konohagakure. Ibiki wasn't one to not give someone what they were credited for. So he would. Yes, the blonde-haired boy had gotten into Konohagakure. However, he was 2 years too late. Ibiki grabbed the boy by his shoulder roughly and patted it roughly also. "Don't worry boy, you'll be just fine," he said in a vile tone. He had a grin spread on his face as he looked down at his newest assignment. The IT agent felt like laughing, no cackling. The situation was just too much. He quickly pushed it aside and headed towards the IT department. The shinobi had some talent, but after facing a man so menacing, even more menacing than Ibiki himself, he was sure the boy would crack. Besides, when he wanted to be the Yondaime Hokage was a terrifying man. The ashes were his past aggressions. He sleeps on grass that smells like the sun. He faces no evil but the gun that is turned to his eyes to determine if he is a spy for wages of war or more. Namikaze Minato was fuming. He had been fuming since the beginning of the week, however it was only getting worse now. The flame had been ignited earlier in the week when he was in his office working on his never-ending paperwork. An Anbu barged into his office. She gave him a worried look and quickly bowed. "Hokage-sama," she greeted. Her voice cracking, and Minato could tell that what he was about to hear was going to be bemusing. "Yes, Dove?" he asked. He gave her his full attention and she shifted her weight on her left leg, then on her right leg. Most people knew the Namikaze to be a patient man and he waited for her to speak. She cleared her throat and began. He could feel her unease. "I have just gotten word that someone has infiltrated Konohagakure." Before she could even finish, he stood up and slammed his hands on the desk. She jumped and Minato determined something about her. "New on the job? What do you mean, Dove? Shinobi were securing the border, right?" Minato didn't really snap at her, or he didn't mean to. She jumped once more at his tone and nodded her head. "Why yes, sir. However, there is one more significant piece of data about the intruder." Minato could hear the poor Anbu gulp. "And what is it?" "He is hinging as your son." Minato glared at the door of the IT center. He was waiting so patiently for Ibiki and Inoichi to join. He looked at the clock that ticked on the walls. It had been longer than he believed, but he didn't care. He was a very patient man. After another 15 minutes of waiting, he could hear footsteps echo in hallways. The Yondaime slightly tensed up but relaxed again. "At the seals on him, Yamanaka. It'd be best that we be careful with the boy," he heard Ibiki say, and soon the man had entered the room. He looked tired and a bit calm. Minato gave a questioning glance at the IT agent. "He hasn't said anything yet really. On the way here he didn't beg and plead for mercy, so I'd give 2 minutes with you and he should crack," he said and gave the Yondaime a smirk. Minato chuckled and shrugged. "We can only hope so." They began to set up, which took a few minutes. He heard some footsteps and quirked his eyebrow at the door. So suddenly, as he did, a woman in a nurse outfit came in. He recognized her as Shizune. Her eyes were all over the place until they finally landed on his. She scurried over towards him. She was holding 2 pieces of paper. The first he saw was a white one with an odd design on it, and the second was a pink one with words on it. A few seconds later, Inoichi came in with a horrid look on his face. He looked behind him, then back in the room, then behind him once again. "Okage-sama, this interrogation must be stopped immediately," she said in a firm tone. Minato didn't spare any time and scowled at her. "That man is impersonating my son and you want to stop me?" he said in a lethal tone. She winced and took a step back. She shook her head and cleared her throat. "Hokage-sama, I ran some blood tests on him," and she stopped and looked down at her papers. Her voice was a hushed, soothing tone. "Hokage-sama, he is your son. The other realm has awakened." Soft snow fell to the ground, the breeze was cool, and the air snipped at her nose. She opened her eyes wide in shock and looked around her small village. Others looked around also, with question in their eyes. The snow began to get thicker and when it touched the ground it only piled high. It never snowed in Konohagakure. Kushina frowned as she rushed back to home, hugging herself as it got colder. "What the hell is going on?" She soon stopped her question as she felt a tug on her stomach. It was a weird pull, and it was like she had to follow it. Her face soon became stoic as she walked over towards Pole, located at the IT center. Her mind was screaming, begging for her to get it under control. It felt like something was trying to reach for her. However, she couldn't control it and she allowed herself to be taken wherever she needed to be. Upon her arrival, the pole stopped and she was just standing in front of the high security building. She regained full control and she panicked. "What the hell was that?" she questioned. Her belly flipped as she looked at the building once more. There was something in there for her, but she didn't know exactly what it was. Biting her lip, she took a hesitant step forward. "Whatever it is, it can't be as bad as that feeling I had years ago." She mumbled to herself and walked towards to the entrance where 2 guards that looked at her with bemused faces, and for some odd reason she said, "I was called here by my husband." But that sentence the guards allowed her in. "Don't be ridiculous, Shizune," Minato growled out. His eyes much darker than normal. "We both know that that isn't at all possible." Shizune protested no further and allowed the Hokage to walk past her and into the interrogation room. Minato looked at the boy for a second and felt like scoffing and gasping. This was his hinge. If the boy was a spy then he had some awful intel, but at the same time it was sickening to see how he got almost every feature right. The boy's hair was blonde, which was not his son's hair color. His son's hair color was a fiery red, just like his wife. And the boy's eyes were a dark blue, just like his wife. His son had light blue eyes. However, those weren't the most out there details, the one that struck the most were the whiskers. They looked like scars, possibly so. If anything, the boy most likely got them from his clan as initiation markings, and he couldn't get rid of them when he hinged. "Naruto?" he questioned. There was that little part of him that wanted to believe that this was his son and that he had returned to Konohagakure. He wanted to believe that his son would just appear with his red hair and light blue eyes and scream surprise. "Did you miss me?" He wanted to believe that it was just another prank and he'd say, "Yeah, I did miss you." And they'd reunite with all Konohagakure. But that was just some flimsy fantasy that would never be achieved because his son was gone. The fake Naruto looked up at him with sad eyes and instantly Minato knew that look. Minato sighed and shook his head. "Whatever sick game this is, it's over. You can undo your horrible henge and tell me who sent you." The fake Naruto's face was scrunched up with confusion. "What do you mean sick game?" he questioned. Minato grunted. "So you think you're innocent?" "Innocent of what?" Minato bit back the urge to yell at the stubborn kid. "Of infiltrating Konohagakure and spying." Naruto wanted to barf out his guts and ultimately punch something. What the hell happened? Where am I? He was honestly confused and felt as though he might have a panic attack. "I infiltrated Konoha and spied people." "No way. Where's your proof?" He blurted out and he could feel the fox rumble inside him, most likely wanting to take over his body to control this whole thing. But they couldn't because he knew his dad would notice instantly. Mostly because of the change of his eyes, because no one would ever get suspicious if his eyes automatically turned into red slits, but also because of the change in his chakra. Minato's eye twitched a bit and he opened his mouth to answer but shut it quickly again. So they had no proof. He also already knows it's me. What did I travel to a place where I was a criminal? I don't have any. Minato said, looking a bit irritated. But isn't it a bit strange for you to hinge as my son? By the way, you can cut the crap. I already know that you're not Naruto. So then why did you call me Naruto? He blurted out again. Minato looked taken aback, his eyes wide and his mouth open to retort, but soon it snapped shut and Naruto gulped as the yondaime glared at him. I'm asking the questions, aren't I? I'm being falsely accused, aren't I? Minato looked incredibly frustrated now. Usually his yondaime status and his piercing stare had a way to get to people to just talk, but the boy wouldn't even budge. Stubborn. Sighing, Minato retreated back out and went to get help. It seemed he wouldn't be able to get the truth out of the boy, so he knew the one person that could. Inoichi, I need your assistance. Kushina struggled as she looked out the glass window and at the boy sitting in the chair. His hair was a sunny blonde color, reminding her of bright days, as well as his eyes. The whiskers on his cheeks looked like deep cuts, and she wondered who could do that to a boy as innocent as he. She had half the mind to rip apart whoever did that. Why is that boy being interrogated? She asked the guard, who gulped at the question. Can't you see Kushina-sama? He is pretending to be your son. She looked at the guard in full disdain. He's not pretending. Was all she said before she looked out the window again. This boy, whoever he was, in some shape or form was her son. She could feel it. Outside it continued to snow. The slow drizzle had turned harsh and overwhelming, leaving a lot of people to scurry into their houses last second. It seems we have an unexpected guest, said a figure in the dark. Yes, and a new experiment, said another, who had a sly grin. It seems we will have our way after all. That was very stupid of you. The gruff voice spat at him, making him want to retort, but he knew that that would be impossible, so he settled for just listening. You should have allowed me to take control. When you knew your father, he was much nicer then because you were his son. And there it was again, everyone implying he wasn't the yondaime's son. He was, and the fox knew it, but he couldn't exactly protest to the fox without looking like he needed to get to a psychiatric hospital. Even his own father, who looked him eye and called him Naruto, still said he was faking it. He had one clue as to what to happen, and he figured he wasn't where he was supposed to be. It was the past, but not his past. Something was screwed up during your sealing. You sent us to a whole other dimension. Naruto faltered but kept a stoic face. Whole other dimension. What messed up kami out there decided to screw with me so much that they sent me to a dimension where another me was already alive? That must have been the reason as to why everyone was so on edge about him. There was another him in this world, living and breathing, and he just so happened to get in the way and appear as a wat. Did his dad call him a hinge? It seemed that this situation meant that he'd have to begin to think like Shikamaru, which was no easy feat. Closing his eyes, he decided to begin to think of a story for himself. Who was he seeing? As how there was another Naruto occupying this world? He could not say that. Also, he couldn't reveal himself as in Uzumaki. Giving up my name is one thing, but my identity? This some real cruel stuff. Naruto also had to figure out exactly how old he was supposed to be. He was no longer an adult, but was now a kid. And not just some teenager kid, but a kid. Then that means that the other Naruto in this world is young too. He's possibly in the academy, give or take I say 10 years old. Naruto snapped his eyes open and tried to hide the obvious discomfort when he noticed someone watching him. Behind that thick glass someone was looking at him, he couldn't tell who because the glass mirror only reflected himself. I'm guessing they believe you're older than you actually look. Possible in your teens. Naruto ignored the fox and stared begrudgingly at the other person on the other side of the mirror. You can stop staring. He said flatly, his tiny voice showing off a bit of venom however, not enough to come off as a threat. Stop giving them the impression you are older than you are. Or do you want them to possibly give you a death sentence? Turning his head away he sighed and began to think more on his plan. Inoichi made his way into the room and slightly frowned as he saw the blue eyes look over him calmly. He knew he needed to keep his face devoid of any emotion, but the way those blue eyes looked at him, he couldn't help but have his lips slump into a frown. That is true. Is Naruto gone? Clearing his throat he made his way in front of Naruto, the kid hinging as Naruto and placed his hands on his head. I'm going to be looking through your mind at all of your memories and see exactly who you are. If you would like to confess your crimes then I ask that you speak now. There was a deafening silence, and Inoichi knew that the kid wouldn't talk since he was stubborn. Just like his mother. Inoichi flinched. You know I'm innocent don't you Inoichi-san? Inoichi instantly pulled his hands back and frowned. How do you know my name? He quickly asked. A look of astonishment crossed his face, but he knew he shouldn't be surprised. Because this is Naru, Ino's dad, right? You guys run that flower shop, what was it called again? Yamanaka flowers right? The color in Inoichi's face drained and he faltered slightly. No matter the physical differences he couldn't deny it anymore. Is he really gone, daddy? I must be going, he stated simply and walked out of the interrogation room and into the watching room. I am sorry Hokage-sama but I could not. Inoichi stopped as he looked at the Hokage who seemed to be choking on his sobs. Kushina was also there however she was not sobbing but doing something as simple as smiling. It's okay Inoichi. I will handle it from here. Minato said wiping his face with his palms. Kushina's smile widened and they both watched as Minato walked past the metal door and toward the blonde Naruto. No, he's not really gone Ino-chan. He's right here. He was sitting in an unknown place. The smell of death was everywhere and dead rats lay around the ground. There was no sky, only a dark rock ceiling. Hugging himself he looked around the odd place. It looked like a cave of some sort, with tiny bits of weed sprawled out at some places. There were cages, a lot of them. And there were bodies in those cages. Where am I? Naruto snapped his head up and saw someone walking down the stone path. His feet were bare and his clothes were torn and bloodied. His head was down so he couldn't see his face, but his hair was vibrant red. Uzumaki. Slowly getting up he walked towards the boy's shaking form. He made sure to be careful with every step. He noticed how the boy didn't acknowledge him at all when he finally came up to him. The boy was muttering incoherent words that Naruto couldn't follow. It's okay. He tried to reassure him. I'm going to help you and get out of this place. It's too late. The boy shrieked in horror his face snapping up and Naruto practically jumped back out of the way. It's over, you can't save me. There in front of him was himself. He and the boy had the same features, but just in different ways. The boy's piercing blue eyes screamed at him to go away or to run, but Naruto felt like he had to stay. I'll get you out of here let's go. No, they'll find me and do those horrible things to me. You can't take from this place I'm tied here. Naruto frowned and grabbed the kid's hand. There is no way in hell I'm leaving some kid in this place, Dadabeo. As he dragged the kid along he noticed how there was no security for this place, only the really obvious traps set here and there. The kid hesitated at times, but for most of the way allowed him to pull him until they were at exit. I can't leave, I told you. They'll find us, they'll hurt everyone. Listen kid I know you're scared, but I won't let anyone hurt you. Whatever happened here is history, okay? I'll take you back wherever you belong. The kid simply stood there as Naruto tried to get him outside. It was just one step, one simple step. Yet his very odd lookalike refused to take it. I can't go back, but I can give you what you need to stop them. What? Naruto was ultimately confused at this point. Stop talking nonsense, kid. Let's go. Taking Naruto's hand the kid placed it on his forehead. Naruto watched in horror and in grief as the kid's eyes turned pure white and he began to do some odd jutsu muttering the hand signs. Hell no. Naruto screamed and attempted to pull his hand away, but it wouldn't even move. What is this kid doing? And then he felt it. A sharp pain hit his ribs then his spine, it followed up to his throat and to his brain, and he felt like at any moment he was going to break open. And so suddenly something flashed before his eyes. There were children's bodies everywhere, some with their limbs some without. Some with their heads others without. It horrible and made Naruto want to barf. Who would do this? And then he saw his odd look-alike cowering into a corner and A4 making quick strides to him and laughing maniacally. "This is it, Naruto. We can finally rid you of that horrid demon. Are you ready?" And then there was nothing. "Kushina, do you believe this is a good idea? What I'm doing, I mean." Minato grabbed his bowl of ramen and began to eat it as Kushina devoured her plate at a very odd place. Her features were soft as she set the bowl down and gave Minato a meaningful look. Minato had stopped the interrogation on Naruto a week ago, seeing as how that child was somehow connected with his Naruto's memories. He convinced himself that was his son, but to some odd extent. Since Naruto was recognizing a very large amount of people that entered his room and he talked with them, it was evident to Minato that the boy was not a spy. However, Naruto played dumb when asked exactly who he was. Although the blonde knew what Minato was talking about from clan he was raised and what village, the boy would always answers, "I'm Naruto, the world's #1 knucklehead ninja," and then proceed to do the same nice guy pose guy did. It put Minato on edge since usually when his Naruto said it he'd say, "I'm Namikaze Naruto, Konoha's #1 knucklehead ninja." This Naruto left out the where and who, and it would only be a matter until he would find out. "I'm sure you did what you could," Kushina said, taking a rather small bite of her ramen. "But there's no way we can prove he's some spy, which is not at all true. But we do know that he's Naruto 100%. She nodded at him, giving him a small smile. "Thanks, Kushina. I've already informed Inoichi and Ibiki not to let this information leak out, however I'll have to pull Jiraiya and his team out of that mission." Kushina stopped eating her ramen and gave Minato an incredulous look. "What are you talking about, Minato?" Minato sighed and rubbed his jaw. "I have the feeling we won't be finding him, and I also have the feeling he's already returned to us. Just a bit different." Kushina nodded her head with a grim look on her face. She remembered very well the day Naruto went missing. Everything was cold and dark. Nobody dare concern the Hokage with trivial things that could be discussed later on. The only thing they focused on was finding Naruto. And then she remembered after the first year passed by, people had begun to accept the fact that Naruto possibly didn't make it. They had all said her son wasn't coming back. Everyone had accepted it. Besides her and Minato and the few people that had known them well enough. They called off the search for Naruto after that first year, and slowly, very slowly, Konoha began to go on without Naruto. Everyone knew it wasn't the same, but they began to accept that and honor that he would have been a great ninja. She remembered going past shopkeepers and hearing how they'd rather have Naruto pranking their shops than him gone forever. After that first year without him, Jiraiya and some other ninja refused to give up on Naruto. They still searched whenever they could, whenever they had time, and now Naruto was back. Not with same hair color and all of those minimal things, but by spirit and well body. Whoever this boy was, wherever he came from, it didn't matter because he was still Naruto. He was still Konoha's Naruto. "Yeah, I understand." She smiled at her husband and finished her ramen before placing the bowl in the sink. "But now we just have to get him to tell us where he's from." Naruto looked up at the ceiling, his eyes not exactly focused on anything but his head was. That strange dream he had was beginning to bug him. He thought it was real, but then again, "I told you I can't leave, they'll find everyone." Turning on his side, he narrowed his eyes at the wall. What did it all meant and why did he have that dream? He hadn't had a dream like that since the war. And that was a long while ago. But now he was getting odd look-alikes of him to appear and perform odd jutsus on him. What had that jutsu done anyways? He had had that weird dream of someone trying to rid the demon of his odd look-alike, but then the dreams after that were fuzzy. There was one in particular with him at the academy. But he knew it wasn't really him. "Boy, Naruto. What are you doing? Sitting? What does it look like?" "Iruka-sensei said we had to run laps." Yeah, but I'll finish later. Besides, I run all the time with my dad." "Oh, really? How about I sit beside you? We can talk about Sakura-chan." "Ah, no way." He remembered how that boy looked at him. It was that look he struggled so hard to get from everyone. They were friends, and that boy didn't despise him. In fact, a lot of other people joined him, and those people didn't give him hateful looks. Instead, they seemed genuinely nice. They never once called him names, and they all seemed to be content that he was a part of their group. No, they were a part of his group. It didn't matter though because it wasn't him. He had been accepted long ago and relished in the feeling. But a tiny piece of him wanted that dream to be his life. Turning on his back, he closed his eyes and entered his mindscape, automatically facing the fox. "About time, kid, you had me worried that you'd never come here again." Naruto smiled softly at the fox and sat Indian style on the water. "Yeah, well, it's been an odd few days, and I figured now would be the best time to think about how I talk to dad. He seems to believe me for the most part, however I just don't know how much of the truth I should tell him." "Well, for one thing, kid, don't tell him what actually brought you here. Just tell him you were working on the seal, messed up and ended up here." Naruto stuck his tongue out and shook his head. "No 10-year-old I know knows how to create seals, and if they do, what seal could they mess up to end up here?" The fox grunted. "You have a point, kid. Maybe just tell them you found the seal, it automatically activated, and bam. You ended up here. Naruto bit his lip and thought hard about it. It makes sense, and then I wouldn't have to change my name. But what about my life, what do I tell him? Should I tell him that he died in my dimension, or don't spread all that, kid. Just tell them they are your parents but just in another dimension. No spreading anything about your past life. Yeah, Naruto groaned and scratched his head. There was so much more to figure out, like Madara and Obito, and if there was going to be a war in this dimension. What's the goal though? I have no knowledge about this dimension and don't know if Madara is plotting. All the more to convince Minato to take you in with him. So that way you can get some intel. We'd also have to find the other Jinchuriki if Madara is a threat in this world. Sighing, Naruto agreed and began to rest. He hoped there was no Madara in this dimension and that he'd be able to enjoy his parents while they were with him. Minato opened the door to the room Naruto was in. His eyes scanned it, unapproving of the layout. Even the building Naruto was transported to was mostly for citizens who lost their homes during attacks. Minato still didn't approve. The room was dull and barred off like a cell. There was futon for a bed and a chair and desk in the corner. There was also no windows. How's it going? He asked the blonde who was currently meditating, or that's what it looked like, in the middle of the room. Naruto quirked an eyebrow at Minato and gave him a huge grin. Hey. You finally came. I thought you forgot about me. Minato flinched at those words. I would never forget. No way, Minato said in return, giving Naruto a wide smile. Naruto's eyes widened, but the boy grinned and Minato couldn't even deny any part of it. This is Naruto. Minato walked over towards the shorter blonde and sat beside him, giving him a pat on the back. So what are you meditating about? Naruto gave him a thoughtful look and smiled widely. I guess just about home. Minato's body tensed but didn't allow the kid, his son, to see him so tensed. He had talked with Naruto on several occasions and each time they had gotten closer to each other. Minato would tell Naruto about his adventures in being a shinobi while Naruto would talk about pranks. It only led Minato closer to him, seeing as how close he was to the Naruto he had lost. But never had the shorter blonde ever talked about his home. It was slightly taboo, like talking to Minato about his family, more than Naruto he had lost. What about your home? Minato didn't want to make it seem like he was trying to pry, but he couldn't help but be a little curious and a little worried. What was the village he lived in and what it was like, but then again he didn't want to know much about Naruto's parents. He had found his son and he couldn't just let him go. Stop being so selfish, if Naruto wants to go home he may go, doesn't matter. Naruto gave Minato a grim look. I'm just thinking about what it'd be like if I never came here. What do you mean? Minato asked, concerned. Well, I mean, I wondered what people are thinking if they are worried about where I'm at. I wonder if they ever come looking for me. Naruto knew it wasn't true, no one was looking for him. But he had to play into the character of a 10-year-old boy who just popped into some weird dimension. He had to pretend like he was concerned for his home, even though the concern for that place left him long ago. Well, what village did you come from? Minato asked. Minato knew that in some part of Naruto worlds he was a part of Konoha. It may have been some spiritual thing or something to do with his son, but this Naruto knew Konoha as if it was his home. But that wasn't possible since there was only one Konoha on all the earth. He tried to not get Naruto overwhelmed with all the questions because the kid was only 10 years old. How would he know anything about what you ask him? He's just as in the dark as you. Naruto took in a deep breath. There's something I didn't tell you from before. What is it? Maybe I was wrong. I can't tell you unless you bring Kushina-chan with you. Minato almost sprinted out of the room at that moment in time. But he decided to tread carefully out of the door to get Kushina-chan. Had Naruto almost called her mom? Minato smiled. Maybe he could bring his family together again. Piece by piece. Jiraiya looked down the creek in bemusement. His eyes flashed with a sense of betrayal and relief. Why do you think Minato-sama stopped the search? Obito asked the white-haired Sannin. Jiraiya looked over at the Obito with a knowing look. Beats me. He said, but he knew that something was up. He could feel it, he knew something marvelous and dangerous had just happened. We'll head home and see what's it's all about. Ugh, Kyuubi, I can't take it. This is idiotic. Calm down. But it's been forever, what if I never see it again? Sighing, the fox rolled his red eyes, trying to figure out a way to get his jailer to calm down. The blonde idiot had been jumping around since the yondaime left, yelling about damn Raymond of all things. They traveled to another dimension and he's concerned about Raymond. If you think about it, kid, this is actually good for you. You won't be shoving down pure calories down your throat. Naruto, even though he was a grown man, was still very picky about his food. And the piled vegetables with fish was getting old. He usually had his own ramen cups when out on missions, but would take anything if he didn't have any more. But it had been a full 2 weeks without ramen. He was practically dying and of course the furball had said this stuff was good for him. Whatever, he mumbled out. He began to poke at his food, giving it a frown as a peer rolled around his plate. So gross. Getting up he opened the door and placed the food outside on the welcome mat. Even though it was a building made for civilians he still didn't feel right inside a building. He had been living in a tent for a few years that it became normal. And now he had a bed and a room and a desk. It was a very big difference from the dirt and animals he lived among. He peeked his head outside and couldn't help but crack a smile. It was the same Konoha he always remembered. "Get your ass back in here, idiot." Naruto frowned and shut the door. Before he could demand an explanation the fox began to speak. "Don't you remember that red-head doppelganger? Think about what would happen if anyone saw you." Naruto took this into consideration. He'd never really thought about it before. That's right. The redhead must have been from this dimension. But why would his dad treat him like a son if he already had one in this dimension? And why would his mom do the same? It was all very confusing. "You hopeless brat." Just as Naruto was about to retort someone had opened the door. Kushina had the plate in her hands while Minato quirked an eyebrow at him. "Naruto, how come you didn't finish your meal?" Naruto gave the taller blonde a sheepish smile and scratched the back of his head. "I wasn't hungry." Ironically Naruto's stomach growled. Kushina chuckled while Minato just shook his head and appeared with a picnic basket. "Well, it's a good thing you didn't eat. I was going to make something for us while we talked." Minato said you had something to tell us. Kushina said and headed to the small kitchen in Naruto's home. The blonde nodded. "What are you making?" he asked, hoping calmly that it was ramen. "I'm making my very special ramen." "Ramen?" Naruto jumped up in the air with a pumped fist, not realizing the shocked looks that his parents gave him. "Ramen, ramen, ramen. Ramen, ramen, ramen." He sang doing his own conga dance. "Well, I'm glad you're excited to eat it," Kushina said, giving him a bright smile. "So do you care to tell me the real reason as to why you didn't eat your lunch?" Naruto sighed and sat on the desk chair as Minato handed the picnic basket to Kushina so she could make her ramen. "Because it's gross." Naruto tried to explain. "Back at home I only eat ramen." Minato frowned. Who was feeding him? A ramen-only diet was like a wish for health problems. He'd have to teach Naruto how to eat more healthy. But he was glad he was still the same. Only wanting ramen. "If only I could eat like that again," Kushina said, pouting slightly. Minato knew how much his wife loved the meal and when they were younger she would eat only ramen too. But as soon as she became a shinobi she was forced to eat the green vegetables and the grains. She had hated them for a long while. However, in order to become a great ninja you have to eat right. "Do you want to become a ninja, Naruto?" Kushina had hoped the answer was yes. She remembered how excited and happy her Naruto was when she first took him to the academy. Naruto seemed slightly hesitant in his answer. Of course, but why were they treating him like this? They had their own Naruto here, unless he was wrong with his visions. But Minato had recognized him on sight. He couldn't go to the same academy with another Naruto lurking around. But how would he get the intel he needed on the Akatsuki, Madara, and he needed to get to Sasuke, especially if Itachi had killed all of his clan? "I don't know." Minato, seeing the change in Naruto's demeanor, frowned. Was he not allowed to become a shinobi in his village? Was he told he couldn't do it? "Naruto, I'm sure we can get you into the academy, we'll train in all of the stuff that you missed out on and try to get you into your age group. How does that sound?" Naruto looked up at Minato confused. He'd have to tell them that he was from a different dimension and that they could stop acting like he was the only Naruto here in Konoha. But he decided to take the offer anyways. It was too good to pass up. "Sounds great," Naruto said, his happy demeanor returning. They talked a bit more and Naruto brought up an interesting question. "What's it like being a Kage?" Minato took the question into consideration. "Well, it's very interesting. You get to see ninja from all over the world and learn from them. You also get to see their homes and visit." Naruto felt like snorting. His dad was definitely dumbing it down. Just like old man Hokage had told him. It was a lot more than visiting and meeting ninja from all over. More like killing ninja from all over. "What type of ninja have you two seen?" Kushina thought for a moment. "Well, I've met ninja from the Sand Village. They have great medic nin there," Kushina said. She wouldn't tell Naruto that she had hated their guts because they were stuck-up brats, but she wouldn't deny their medical kunoichi were amazing. "I've seen Kumo ninja, their Raikage's speed and lighting affinity seems endless," Minato said as if looking back on a past battle. "They are also very strong." Naruto nodded, knowing this to be true. The Raikage was one tough cookie. It still surprised him to this day that he had beaten him in speed during the beginning of the war. The ramen is done," Kushina said, setting out bowls from her picnic basket. She then got the big of ramen and began to fill up the bowls. Because there was no dining table they set up on the floor. "Itadakimasu," they all said and began to eat. Naruto, being the barbarian that he was when it came to ramen, scoffed it down in a hurry. Kushina looked at him horrified. "Naruto," she snapped. The boy stopped with noodles hanging out of his mouth and blinked at her. Mind your manners," she said. "Eat properly." Naruto gave her bemused look. He never really learned table manners, but since he hung around big clan heads during his time as Rakudame, he guessed he knew how to. After finishing the noodles in his mouth he mumbled an apology and ate right. Halfway through the meal Minato decided to ask the question that was bugging him for so long. So what village are you from, Naruto? He instantly regretted it as Naruto blanched suddenly, placing his ramen down on the floor. Oh right, I was going to tell you about that. He said mostly to himself. I'm actually from Konoha. Minato frowned. He would have known if a doppelganger of his son was walking around his village. What do you mean, Naruto? Kushina asked once the blonde stopped elaborating. I kind of came to this Konoha by accident. You see, I think I'm in a different dimension. Kushina was so confused. A different dimension. Yeah, back in my Konoha, well, it's not exactly like this one. Not anymore. What happened? Minato asked. If Naruto was from a different dimension it would only mean that he was his son, just not in this world. Well, Konoha got attacked. Naruto said sadly. It wasn't entirely a lie. And if anything he learned from Jiraiya that he shouldn't lie, but just speak about fragments of the truth. I was trying to help, but somehow I ended up in the hospital and I saw Shizune-chan. I thought I had died because Naruto looked down at his ramen. And then I was being interrogated and I knew I hadn't died. I didn't mean to come here, I was trying to help my village. Minato noticed how Naruto added the last part quickly. Do you remember how you ended up here? I remembered old man Hokage telling me about Fuinjutsu. So I tried to do it myself and I had no idea what I was doing, but he said Fuinjutsu was very powerful. So I tried to make something. He must have been really close to the Sandaime for Sarutobi-sama to tell him something like that. Minato thought. And you ended up here. Kushina finished for him. She knew her clan had plenty of space-time jutsu, however she didn't think that they'd be powerful enough to send someone to a whole other dimension. Mianto was fairly impressed. For a 10-year-old to just mess with seals and actually have something happen, that in itself was an accomplishment. But it seemed like Naruto wasn't telling him something. But go with the story for now. Naruto secretly let out a breath. It seemed as though they believed his story, however Minato looked troubled. But you told me yesterday you don't think anyone would be looking for you. Why? Aren't me and Kushina-chan there looking for him? Isn't Jiraiya there for him? Everyone besides the old man Hokage and a few others hated me. Kushina felt like punching someone in the stomach. Why would they hate you? You're only 10 years old. Naruto gave them a sheepish look. I have a tendency to play pranks and sometimes they go too far. He would purposely leave out the Kyuubi and demon stuff. Minato knew that this hatred may have gone a little deeper than pranks. But he played along anyways. Ah. Well, here I'm sure the villagers will love you, Naruto. Kushina nodded, giving him a small smile. But you must have another Naruto here, right? Since everyone I've seen here is in my world, there's gotta be another. You just can't have two Narutos walking around. Kushina's smile faded and Minato tried his keep smile on his face. Naruto, what exactly happened to your parents in your world? Naruto frowned. They died to protect the village. That was the only answer Minato had gotten from the shorter blonde. Who were they? Kushina asked. She knew, but she wanted to see if Naruto knew. Old man Hokage never told me. He just said that they died protecting Konoha and me, but I'm guessing they had to be Uzumaki's. Minato looked at Kushina and smiled. So their son hadn't grown up with them and he grew up with his mother's maiden name to protect him, most likely. It seems like Kami has an odd way of twisting things around in our world. Naruto, we're going to be your parents now. Minato declared. Naruto looked up at them with nothing but brimming tears in his eyes. He nodded softly. There's no need to cry. Kushina said and gave her son a comforting hug. You have your parents now and we have our son. Minato got up and gathered the plates. Thank you for cooking, Kushina-chan. And thanks for telling us about this, Naruto. He gave his son a smile. Naruto really couldn't keep his emotions in. He had never had his parents. He'd always been alone growing up, but now he could start over with his parents. The only question that hadn't been answered was about the other Naruto. He wondered about that but decided not say anything since he had a clue as to what happened. With the way that his parents treated him and what his dreams had shown, it was slowly starting to add up. Well, let's get cleaned up and try to get you out of here so can come with us. Minato suggested, hoping it wasn't too much for Naruto. He knew how it felt being an orphan. He was hoping that Naruto would be more open like he was and not closed off like some of the other kids at the orphanage. Naruto looked up at his father and jumped in the air, giving another victorious fist pump in the air. Ramen, and now this. This is the best day ever. Ugh, please tell me you are not reverting back to that childish brat you once were. It was fun being a childish brat. Minato smiled happily at his son and Kushina did too. They finally had their family back. It didn't take long for Naruto to gather his stuff from his room. He didn't have much besides some clothes. Since he traveled to this new dimension, he hadn't brought anything with him besides some money which was given back to him in his same toad wallet. He would never change that wallet no matter how childish people said it was. Alright Naruto, you're going to have to hold on tight. Minato said, and Naruto did, knowing that he was going to use the Flying Thunder God technique. It was pretty traumatizing if you weren't prepared for it, just like the first time he did it. Kushina held on to Minato's right arm as Naruto held on to his other. Here we go. Minato declared, and suddenly they were in a house. Minato looked down at Naruto with worried eyes. Usually people threw up when he first did that technique on them. That was awesome. Naruto declared. He had never used his father technique in such a way. It was usually on the battlefield to go short distances. Minato looked at Naruto surprised, and Kushina did too. It looked like they had the same energy ball from before. Alright Naruto-chan. I'll show you your room. Kushina said, ecstatic. Naruto noticed the nickname but didn't say anything about it. He liked it. Taking his hand, she practically tore his arm off as she showed him the estate, which wasn't as large as what other estates were. They were only 7 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and 3 living rooms. There were also 2 kitchens, one upstairs and one downstairs. Kushina first showed him the library, which said he would be learning about ninja stuff. She then showed him Minato's office and then her tea room, to which she chatted with other women about womanly stuff. He asked any further questions. They then got to his room. Alright Naruto-chan, go ahead and open the door. Naruto twisted open the knob and couldn't believe his eyes. This was better than the Hokage suite at the Hokage Tower. There were a whole bunch of stuffed toads and foxes, they were all piled onto his bed. There was a weapon rack on his wall which had a seal on it, he noticed. There was a desk with the essential things to study, and there was a small bookshelf with scrolls and books he never heard of. However, there was one he saw there, and he couldn't help but reach out and grab it. The Tale of the Utterly Gutsy Shinobi. He whispered to himself. Kushina looked at him surprised. Had he read this book in his world? She remembered when Jiraiya first got it for him on his 9th birthday. The first birthday they had had without him. Do you know of it? Kushina asked. I used to read it all the time. He admitted. Of course, when he was Hokage, he read it all the time. The memory of his sensei and godfather, why wouldn't he read it all the time? Besides, the book was great. Placing the book back on the shelf, he smiled up at Kushina. I love this room. Thanks. He said. Kushina gave him a warm smile. Now go ahead and rest up, we have training to do tomorrow. Kushina said, and she hurried off. Naruto looked at her with wide eyes. He'd finally be able to train. I don't see how can this could any better. Minato had headed out of his house hours before he really wanted to, but he couldn't exactly stay around since he was the Hokage. He was jealous of Kushina being able to spend time with Naruto all day while he went and did paperwork. It was very tiring. However, he needed to do his job or else no one else would. Sighing, he headed off to work. He didn't always take advantage of the Flying Thunder God technique, but he didn't exactly like the cold. He wasn't very fond of it as a kid, and he hated how it somehow showed up in Konoha. So he just used his technique to get to the tower. The secretary, Katsu, gave him a dull look. Sandaime-sama is here. He said dryly. Why are all Nara always so bored? However, the Nara was better than some of those fangirls. He shuddered. Thanks, Katsu. The bored boy nodded his head and began to play with his pencil. Minato had actually grown fond of the bored boy. Even though he always found things troublesome, the boy really had good intentions. His mind was sharp, and that would get him to wherever he wanted to go. Minato entered his office to see Sarutobi looking at the pictures on his desk. A solemn look was on his face. Morning, Yondaime-sama. Morning, Sandaime-sama. Sarutobi looked up at the blonde and sighed. It seems I will be taking over here since the Raikage has called for a Hokage summit. Minato's eyes hardened. He had never been to a summit before, but he believed it to be very dangerous. A time where enemies could try and do my village harm. I see, he said. He believed he could spend some time with his son and even train him. It seemed that that would be on hold. You may want to say goodbye to your wife, and I'm guessing you might want to grab Kakashi to take him with you to your summit. Minato nodded his head. Jiraiya and the rest of the search team should be returning in a few days. Minato updated him. Sarutobi gave him a questioning look but did not say anything. Whatever Minato believed was right, he did too. He wouldn't hand down his hat to anyone he didn't believe couldn't make wise decisions. Well then, you should be on your way. Kushina had awoken without her husband by her side and a note saying he had left for a cage summit. She frowned slightly as to how they had just gotten their son back, but he'd have to wait a few weeks to return to him. She washed up that morning and went to wake Naruto so he could start his training. However, the blonde bundle of energy was already up and not in his room but in the library. He was looking at a book with very deep concentration and seeing the title she frowned. Jutsu. The basics. She wondered if he was trying to find a way home. Clearing her throat, she got her son's attention. He looked up at her with a foxy grin. Morning. Good morning, Naru-chan. What are you reading? Stuff about Jutsu. I already know all of this, though, the blonde thought to himself. But he had to make his story believable. I want to learn more about it. Sounds reasonable enough. How about you go wash up and eat breakfast and I'll help with it. she said. Naruto shot up from his seat in the room and smiled widely. Okay. Kushina was surprised at how quick Naruto was learning. She was no master like her husband, but it seemed her son would be. He quickly grabbed the concepts of the characters and sealing. He had also done a low D rank sealing technique used to seal small items like food and such. Great job Naru-chan. She praised. Now let's go get some sun in the backyard. I'm sure you want to learn something else, right? Naruto smiled widely. Yup. As they headed out, Naruto noticed that it was snowing. Kushina sighed. It has been snowing on and off for 2 whole weeks. I wonder what it could be. They headed out in appropriate gear. Kushina had made sure to send the Anbu away. She didn't want them seeing Naruto yet. Alright, so tell me what you know about chakra. Well, it's essential to every being. It is the spiritual energy within that is needed to do even the most basic jutsu. Naruto answered. Kushina nodded her head at his answer. And how do you channel it? Through hand signs. But some ninja don't need hand signs to do it. Kushina smiled. It seemed Naruto knew more than she thought he did. Yep. Some ninja who don't use hand signs to channel their chakra can't use hand sings. Naruto cocked his head to the side. He had never heard of that. Kushina giggled at his confused face. It's hereditary, Naruto, but the reason you don't see that in a lot of ninja is because it's a recessive trait. Meaning most people use hand signs because it's not in their blood not to use signs. Naruto nodded his head. That made sense. So it's like writing. Most people write with right hand because it comes natural, while some people write with left because it's natural to them. Yep. Now I have the recessive trait, so it may be hard for you to follow me if you've been using hand signs for a long time, but it's a good thing you're young. Or else this would be harder for you. Kushina said, oblivious to the fact that not Naruto was sweat dropping. Just my luck, Naruto thought. Well, what if I've become comfortable with hand signs? Kushina blinked. Well, you are my son. You should pick up my style pretty quickly since I know an easier way of showing it. Kushina suddenly pulled out a slip of paper and instantly Naruto knew what he needed to do. Chakra nature types. Here, just hold the paper and send some chakra into it. She said. Naruto did as he was told and just like last time the paper split in half. Kushina smiled happily. So you have the wind efficiency. Now we can begin the training. Have you done chakra control before, Naru-chan? Naruto nodded. He hated those exercises Jiraiya had him to do. The old man had been so brutal with it. Great, we don't have to waste time with that. Naruto gave her a confused look. You mean I don't need really good chakra control for this? Kushina laughed and shook her head. This is an Uzumaki technique passed down from generation to generation. Because of our massive chakra reserves, we don't need the best chakra control for most of our jutsus. Naruto sighed in relief. Thank Kami. Now let's get started. Naruto was panting on the ground, his body sore and his throat dry. That had been the most intense training he'd ever done, and that's including being thrown off a cliff. His mom was one slave driver. Kushina stood over Naruto with a smile on her face. The kunoichi hadn't broken a sweat. He wondered why he didn't hear more stories about his mother since she was so strong. Naruto, you've gotten pretty far in your training, but now it's time to head back inside. Just one more round. He begged. He honestly wanted to get the technique down to a T. Alright, just one more round. AN. When thinking of this scene, think about Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's the only way I can really think of how to explain it. Naruto had believed his mother was going to show him a jutsu, however she had shown him a fighting style. It had been passed down from generation to generation of the Uzumaki clan and it was harder than he thought it was. Getting up on his feet he wobbled a bit but his mom just stood there getting into position. He also got into position and took in a deep breath. Then he did the necessary hand signs and air formed around his hand. His mother had said it was like bending the elements to make them with you. It only required a bit of his chakra since he had so much and it was so easy to manipulate. He then began to bend the wind like chakra, so if he hit his opponent, it would rip through the skin, and if he missed he could blast the opponent from far away. However, the chakra was hard to hold. It wasn't like a Rasengan where he'd hold for only a couple of seconds. He'd have to hold throughout the whole battle, and it would blister his hands. His mother easily pumped the chakra into her hands and he ran at her. She stomped her foot on the ground and suddenly the earth she stomped on popped up. He dodged it and pumped more chakra into his hands and blew the earth away with his wind. She then threw a piece of earth at his blind sight. He dodged that one too but barely. Mixing Taijutsu with her earth manipulating moves, she easily overpowered him and she wasn't even breaking a sweat. But Naruto was a different story. Manipulating wind was harder than his mother had made it out to be. His Taijutsu had also suffered with him being only 10 years old. His body wasn't shaped in the way where he could move in different ways. The most he did was dodge a few rocks that his mother threw at him. Finally she ended it by building 4 walls around him. He was trapped and had nowhere to go. We'll start again tomorrow, Naruto. Right now you need some rest. She said, concern laced in her voice. However, he had no time to answer when he fainted with exhaustion. Kushina sighed. He was just like me when I first learned. She picked up and hurried him back inside. She needed to bandage his wounds. He's the same stubborn boy I remembered him being. There was a sudden ringing of the doorbell, and Kushina placed Naruto in his bed, giving him a small peck on his forehead. Kushina returned to living room. Yes. Kushina said upon opening the door. Makoto Uchiha stood there with a small smile on her face. Itachi and Sasuke were standing just behind her. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Kushina-sama, but my home has been overrun by husband's police force. Boys' night out, you know. Tell me about it. Kushina said, remembering Minato's comrades invading her house. Come on in. I see you have been training, Kushina-sama. Itachi said, looking at the Riti's attire. She was wearing her Kunoichi outfit fit for training, so the Uchiha only assumed. Well yeah, but it was too cold so I didn't do much. She shrugged, walked into the kitchen. May I use the restroom? Sasuke asked. Kushina nodded, giving the Uchiha a smile. You remember where it is, right? Sasuke nodded his head. Even though he hadn't been over in a whole year, he knew where everything was because he was Naruto's best friend. Heading down the hallway, he finally found the bathroom and opened the door. However, it seemed as though he didn't remember where the bathroom was because it was Naruto room. He was in another cave, this time it was bright orange color. The torches that hung on the walls dimly lit the walls that had swirls all around them. The faint smell of poison and death lingered in the air and sent chills down his spine. He knew this place. Sasuke. He began to walk down the hallways of the cave that he remembered Sasuke was hiding in. When he first came to this place, he remembered the adrenaline had pumped through like a water hose, but he had no energy left in him. His shoulders slumped forward and a familiar pain lingered in his hands. Training with mom. He thought to himself as he looked at the blisters on his palms. He knew this was another vision, but he didn't think that his current state would be transferred through. It's not like he would be fighting anyways, he could never help in the visions, no matter how hard he tried in the past. Lingering down the odd-shaped hallways, he tried to remember where he found Sasuke before. Of course he wouldn't, because at the time the only thing on his mind was finding Sasuke. He hadn't even considered the layout of the cave. He wondered how his doppelganger had found this place and decided to show it to him. Was it a part of the other Naruto's past as well? Was this the place he'd finally get answers in? He had no clue, but decided to continue his search. Opening doors would be a waste of time, but something compelled him to do so. The door, which was poorly crafted out of wood, sat in front of him. Could hear faint voices inside. Pressing his ear closer to the door, he concentrated hard on trying to figure out what they were saying. Ugh, this is boring. You're supposed to be awesome. I thought we were going to train. Patience, you too. If you want to become the best ninja, you have to patience. We've been having patience for the last hour and a half. I'm done with this meditation stuff, come on Naruto. Widening his eyes, Naruto took his ear off the door and considered for a long moment if he should open the door. This must have not been his memory. He never hung with Itachi and Sasuke. In fact, he was usually only with one or the other in dire situations, like trying to kill each other. Eager to find out what else would happen, he opened the door slowly. And to his utter disappointment, it was only an empty room. Naruto's heart sank at the revelation. This is some sick game. Naruto thought to himself. It's not even me. He continued to walk, and he continued to listen to conversations at the doors, each one different with its own significance. Sometimes they'd be arguing, but most of the time they just talked. It sounded nice, all those conversations. He wished he had talked to Sasuke before their rivalry, then maybe they'd be just like them. Then maybe I wouldn't have to come here. He opened another door and it once again revealed an empty room. He knew the results, but he couldn't help but check. If he could just a glimpse, maybe he could see the life he always wanted. Backing away again, he finally made his way to the end. The first time he saw Sasuke after he left the village. Sasuke. He called out in a low whisper. He made his way outside and saw the debris that littered the ground. He then looked up. Sasuke wasn't there, but he something. Voices. He climbed up the rubble, slipping a few times, but he always got back up. It was a hard climb since at points and times he didn't have anything to hold on to. And every time he slipped and fell back on the ground, the voices got further and further away. Sasuke. He called out a bit more loudly. He tried and tried, feeling the blisters on his hands getting worse. They began to bleed. But he didn't care. He knew that whatever was up there was worth seeing. He needed to see it. So he climbed once more, gripping the rocks tightly and wincing in pain as they dug deep in his already open skin. He had made it to the top and tried to pull himself up, but there was nothing to grab. Only dead grass and weeds sprung around his hands. And then it hit him. He would never be able to see whatever it was at the top. There was nothing left of his strength, he had no more power in his body. I didn't think you were one to quit, Naruto. Looking up at the voice, his eyes widened and his heart dropped. Pink hair and light green eyes looked at him almost accusingly. Come on, don't you want to join us? Sakura-chan. The girl's brow furrowed and she took a step back. Ugh, stop being so emotional, Naruto. The pint-sized Sakura said. A red bow sat in her hair and she looked at him as if he was completely normal. As if he wasn't the Naruto that just popped up out of nowhere. The Pincat held out her hand and he stared at it for a long while. Do you really want to go back down there? She asked, a frown on her face. I thought you came here to be with us again. Naruto took his hand and noticed how small it gotten. Unlike the usual visions he was now a kid. Where in others he would be his full adult self. She pulled him up with a huff and he gave her a bemused look. Who is us? Smiling, the pint-sized Sakura pointed outward. Let's go. They walked down a dark forest that seemed to be very dangerous. He wondered if this was a secret place he had been excluded from when he was child. It seemed like Sakura expected him to know where to go. Then she ran as they neared a clearing where the forest stopped. Hey guys, I found him. She shouted. He ran alongside with her, afraid of getting lost. And when he made it out of the dark forest and into the clearing, a bubbly feeling entered his chest. He hadn't felt this way since the day he saved Konoha. Despite all the destruction that his village had suffered, everyone came together and he was finally included. The Konoha 11. Each one of them were happily running around in their pint-sized forms, not even caring about what others may have thought of them. Naruto just watched in a daze as the aloof Neji was actually smiling. The last time he saw Neji smile, it was a tragic day. Naruto smiled widely but faltered as he saw something out of the corner of his eyes. Blonde hair, blue eyes, whiskers. He was amongst the Konoha 11, smiling and laughing and playing and just being happy. And it was him. Not a red-headed boy that had the life he always wanted, but him. And very slowly that boy began to fade. Hey. Are you just gonna stand there or are you gonna join us? The Pincat said, waving him over. He didn't have to think twice. As he ran over there he smiled widely until something stopped him. What about what they did to me, to us? I thought you came here to stop it from happening again. Pathetic. What about our village, our friends, our parents? Naruto turned around to see a flock of red hair and a crying boy. He tried desperately to wipe the tears away, but only more came back into his eyes. Please, help me. I want to help you too. I want to stop it from happening too. The boy looked up with pleading eyes, his red hair turning into another color. Blonde. The whisker marks appeared on his face slowly. Naruto stepped back from the crying boy, a fear inside him that he never knew before appeared. Looking behind him he found that the Konoha 11 were gone and a darkening cloud was going over them. The boy cried harder and harder and Naruto decided to comfort him. Getting closer and closer to his doppelganger, the boy began to look more like him. Naruto placed a hand on the boy's shoulders and gave him a bright smile. Hey, it's okay. I'll help, believe it. However, Naruto did not get the response he wanted. The boy only looked up at him with desperate eyes. You have to save them all. You have to get his spirit out of there. What are you talking about? They've already got me, they're going to come after you next. What the hell are you talking about? They Kyuubi, Naruto. They want your half of the Kyuubi. Wait, you mean? Before Naruto could even ask, the boy slowly disappeared. Added Tsuki. Naruto looked at the spot where the boy had vanished and noticed a slip of paper. They were coordinates and they seemed awfully familiar. Sasuke Uchiha rarely believed in supernatural things like ghosts and demons, but he guessed he could be proven wrong. Even just looking in the room, Sasuke felt a pressure in it and a small voice in his head told him to go back, that nothing was there. Another voice, which was much bigger, told him to look in the room. He wouldn't exactly be disturbing anyone if he looked inside and just recalled some memories. So swiftly he made his way inside and took in the scent. It smelled horribly of ramen, and not just the spices used in, but like a person had actually came into the room last night and just had fresh ramen. How odd. He first looked through the closet and recalled that the last time he saw the room, it had been clean, very clean. So why were clothes fallen on the floor and shoes messily thrown inside it? Sasuke felt a chill run up his spine. Someone had been here, but who could it be? The clothes that Naruto had had before were donated off. Now new clothes were hung on the hangers. In all their glory, they were quite tattered up. They were old, the style was off and didn't compare to today's fashion. Not that he cared, but it just indicated someone had placed them there for a 10-year-old boy. The 10-year-old boy who had gone missing 2 years ago and was declared dead a year after. His stomach dropped, he honestly hoped Kushina-sama and Hokage-sama weren't pretending that Naruto was back. Making his room messy and smell like ramen, like he always used to do. And placing clothes on the hangers. Taking in a shaky breath he turned to leave, but then he noticed how the door was shut. He had never shut it. Looking around the room he saw the bed covers were thrown sloppily on the ground and a ton of plushies were scattered around. He hadn't seen anyone in the bed, of course he hadn't though. Why would someone be in the bed? He rolled his eyes at himself, but that didn't stop him from investigating. When did they shut the door? He would have heard, wouldn't he? He opened the door and quickly looked both directions as if crossing a street. He then decided not to go back downstairs. He could hear his mother laughing with Kushina-sama and he assumed that Itachi was waiting for him. He would have called the older brother, but surely Itachi would try to stop him. So turning his back to the other direction, his breath hitched in his throat and he frowned. "Little brother?" Itachi stated dryly, giving him an apathetic look. "What?" Sasuke snapped and Itachi sighed. The older had noticed that Sasuke had been a grouch ever since Naruto was declared dead. He'd snap and fuss at their parents and became aloof to all of the people in the academy. The only people he really respected were the Hokage and his wife, but mainly because, and he quoted, "They get how I feel, you'd never understand." However, that statement was completely untrue. He had had a relationship with a hyperactive boy. It was like he had acquired another little brother. And he had shed tears for the boy. It was biggest fear to lose a little brother, and that was the reason why he always taught them those bizarre and boring meditation skills. He knew they both wanted to become ninja and that they both would be great. But you couldn't be a great ninja if you froze up on every mission. And so if they learned those breathing and meditation techniques, they'd be able to get over that fear of being killed on their first life-threatening mission. He had seen it happen firsthand to his teammate who had been so hungry for action, but as soon as it came he was unable to move because of the killing intent their enemies leaked out. The boy wasn't killed, but he'd never be able to do another mission again. So his biggest fear had came true when Naruto was declared dead, and he wished he could have searched for him, but he wasn't old enough, so he was left to remain saddened by the information like everyone else. Of course, Sasuke declared revenge on the persons who had taken Naruto and killed him. His brother had even gone so far to say he'd becoming a missing nin to get his revenge, of course that was once he got stronger. Itachi looked into Sasuke's fiery eyes, trying not to be affected at how much hatred they spewed out. "Do you still have to go to the bathroom?" Sasuke faltered slightly, as if he'd forgotten about that. And he had. He honestly was up here to go to the restroom. Nodding with a blush on his face, he hurried off to the nearest bathroom, and Itachi waited for him before they headed back downstairs to hear their mother and Kushina planning dinner. "Oh no," Sasuke thought to himself. His mother and Kushina-sama were extremely competitive. And since they both became housewives, they had become competitive with housewife things. Dinners included. And usually the judge would be that of the other person's family. So if his mother were to bring dinner, then her judge would the Hokage-sama and usually Naruto. And Naruto and Hokage-sama were usually too oblivious to see the competitive factor in it. And afterwards Naruto would usually complain about how his mother would be so aloof the day after. Sasuke would roll his eyes and call him a dope because it was painfully obvious that Naruto had complimented his mother's cooking. Which Kushina-sama didn't want. It was odd how best friends were. And Itachi would say him and Naruto were the same. Since birth, Kushina and his mother would pit them against each other, doing something as silly as see which baby could walk first, which Sasuke won, and see which baby would eat all their food, which Naruto had won. It had stuck with them, and when the boys grew older they had these competitions all the time. Who can do the most push-ups, who can accurately hit the target with their kunais, and the most fun of all, who could piss off Iruka-sensei the most. Itachi watched as his mother perked up at the idea of having a dinner. "Sounds great, Kushina-chan. What time tonight?" Kushina frowned. "Not tonight, Mikoto-chan. I'd like for all the clan heads and their children to be there." Itachi's mother looked stunned. It must have been important if Kushina-sama wanted all the clan heads over. He knew that the Redeed Kenweichi didn't exactly like all the clan heads. So for her to invite them to dinner was saying something. This was no pesky competition, but that's all that Itachi could take from the invitation. "Of course Itachi and Sasuke are invited," Kushina said, giving both boys a wide grin. Sasuke looked up at his brother with a small frown. He thought it would be a grown-ups only thing, but he guessed that grown-ups did have a way of keeping secrets even with children there. And he'd guessed that if Itachi and him were invited, then it only meant that the other children were invited as well. Ugh. He thought to himself. He wasn't that he didn't like the other children, but the girls were very annoying. "Well, I'm all up for going. I'll see when Fugaku will able to take time off and contact you," Mikoto said, getting up and stretching. Feeling that something wasn't right, Itachi frowned and looked up the staircase. Out of the corner of his eye he swore he saw something, like that of a long tan leg going into Naruto's room. Looking back at his brother, Sasuke seemed to see the same exact thing. He gave the younger Uchiha a reassuring look, but on the inside his stomach flipped and twisted. Something wasn't right here and he needed to figure out what. "Itachi?" Sasuke called out into the dark room. A shuffle was heard inside, meaning that he could enter. And so he did, and the room soon lit up as Itachi lit 2 candles. The older brother looked down at the younger. Sasuke was very confused as he saw that his brother was all geared up as if going on a mission. He gave Itachi a questioning glance. "I'm going out on a mission," he stated simply. "You didn't go to the tower and there were no messenger birds that came this way." Sasuke looked over his brother and frowned. "It's not like I'd tell mom and dad. I wasn't assigned this mission." Itachi said in a hushed voice. Besides you'd nag to come with. Sasuke rolled his eyes. Either way I'll find out. Just like I found out about Hana. Itachi glared coldly at Sasuke and the younger just smirked. I believe that time you used the I'm training excuse. Itachi let out a frustrated sigh. His brother could be the world to him, then he'd feel like snapping his neck just because he was so annoying. Fine. Gear up. Sasuke did a small victory jump that he had learned from Naruto and went to get all his shinobi stuff. 20 minutes later, Itachi and Sasuke snuck out, their mother was sound asleep and their father was out at a council meeting. It was very easy to slip out of their estate, however Sasuke called attention to himself when he tripped on the flat ground. Oof. Itachi looked down by his side and saw his brother getting up. Boy. Is that Sasuke? Itachi jumped back and into the tree. He decided that, because Sasuke had practically blackmailed him and would be annoying, he'd ditch him. Itachi quietly snuck over the gate and quietly snickered to himself. Foolish little brother. Sasuke, noticing that his brother was gone, looked up at the figure that ran towards him with a confused face. He cursed whatever deity up there that had caused this, but kept outside. What do you want, Aiko? Sasuke spat. I thought it was you. Aiko said, giving Sasuke one of those unbearable grins that reminded him so much of the dope. What are you doing out here? He asked enthusiastically. Sasuke looked at the gate that Itachi must have hopped and groaned. Well, it looks like my plans have changed. You? Aiko gave Sasuke a sheepish look. Sneaking out to the fields for some fresh air. You're already outside. Aiko let out an awkward laugh. Guess you're right. Sasuke pushed himself up and sighed as he dusted the dirt off his newest shinobi attire. I'll tag along. He said with an assertive tone. Sure. Hey you think you can keep this from my mom? This is supposed to be the last straw. Aiko caught up another awkward laugh and Sasuke shrugged. He always hated making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But Aiko seemed to be okay with the shrug and both headed out past the gate. Naruto looked over at his mother with determination. His hands had blisters on them and he was drenching in sweat even though white snow padded the usually green grass and a brisk wind was blowing. His mother was panting but ultimately not as bad as him. She was in a fighting stance waiting for him to come at her. She seemed to be surprised that he had actually improved over just a bit of sleep and 5 bowls of ramen. He gave her a big smirk, then headed straight for her. His speed had increased and she wondered if he was holding back yesterday. He was much more faster, almost at a Jonin level. Unless he was holding back again. Naruto threw a wind strike at her and she barely dodged it. He then striked again, pumping wind out of his hand to hit her so that either way if she dodged or not, she'd be hit. Kushina stomped on the ground and a big wall of earth blocked the attack long enough for her to move to a safe distance away. However, the earth wall split once the wind made contact with it. Kushina quickly threw 3 pieces of earth at her son. She noticed how Naruto had very weak defense as 2 pieces of the earth collided with his back. He did manage to block the third, but it would leave a nasty bruise. Naruto winced slightly but quickly attacked her again. Kushina tried to dodge as much as she could but was quickly hit with 2 wind blades. She noticed how he focused more on big attacks than the smaller ones. Weak chakra control. She thought. Naruto seemed frustrated as Kushina began to hit him with multiple pieces of earth. He must not be used to being so far away from his opponent for so long. She frowned. He shouldn't have slipped into such habits if he was just starting his shinobi career. Naruto, I think that's enough. You've got a good handle on this so far. And that speed of yours is way beyond that of a beginner. Kushina praised her son. He gave her a pained grin and nodded. Thanks. Kushina waved him inside so that she could bandage him up. Little did she know that Itachi was watching carefully with a blank expression on his face. It wasn't the best thing for her to tell the Anbu to head out to their homes. But now he had seen why. This a big secret, Kushina-sama. Itachi muttered to himself. I hope no one else finds out besides myself. Sasuke got into position with a sly grin on his face. Sweat poured heavily down his face, but he didn't care. It was the lazy round of the game and they were as tied. If his team could get another score then they'd win. Hey Aiko, I've got a plan. Aiko, his clumsy cousin, ran quickly towards him with a huff. Do tell. He said excitedly, a hint of mischief in his eyes. Aiko at first may have seemed sweet and completely dense, but he was a complete trickster. He practically lived off manipulation and tricks and of course it slightly rubbed off of him. Sakura seems to be head over heels with you, right? He asked. Aiko blushed slightly and frowned. She likes you, Sasuke. Sasuke rolled his eyes and huffed out a breath. But she likes you too, idiot. Really? That's shocking. Whatever, just listen up. They were playing a nice game of hide and seek with a shinobi twist, of course. Aiko smiled brightly and nodded happily at Sasuke. How'd you get so smart, Sasuke? Sasuke blanched for a second but just rubbed it off. Aiko always liked to get under people's skin. Let's go find our pinkette before you trip. Sasuke and Aiko spread out looking for the girl in question. He knew she would be the easiest to get since she wasn't exactly advanced in any jutsu, however she was smart. That seemed to be biggest problem. He searched the ground with a scowl on his face. He couldn't help but think what it'd be like if his best friend was with him. They would dominate everyone in this game. If Shikamaru wasn't so damn lazy, then he would be their biggest competition. Sasuke searched up high and down low, but there was no sign of the pinket. Settling down on the snowy path, he huffed out a breath of annoyance before he heard something in the distance. "Billboard brow, move aside, you're taking up all the space." "Whatever, no pig." "Ugh, you guys just ruined everyone's cover." "Shut up, dog breath. This is so troublesome." Sasuke turned around and looked at the people coming out of the very huge and very long bush. Sakura, Ino, Shikamaru and Kiba all came out with irritated looks on their faces. "We could have won too if you two hadn't been bickering," Kiba ranted. It was odd seeing Kiba without the white fur dog. "Damn, so this means that we can't do what we were planning," Aiko said, appearing out of nowhere. Sasuke glared at him. "What? You knew they were here this whole time?" "Oh, yeah, I was suspicious to tell you." Aiko let out a mischievous laugh. "He was planning on letting them win this whole time." HN. Sasuke turned his head away from cousin. A sigh escaped from his lips as he looked up at the sky. "I wonder if it'll snow again," Aiko said. "If it does, it just means that the academy will be closed for another week." Kiba pouted. "Man, why did it have to snow anyways? It's only fall." Sakura frowned at the dog Nin. "I like it," she mumbled, but Sasuke could hear it. He himself liked the snow also. Even it was his first time seeing snow 2 weeks ago, it gave him a nostalgic feeling. "I'm heading out, this is a drag." "Good game, Ichiha," Shikamaru said and headed home. Kiba did the same, running to catch up to the lazy Nara. Ino looked over at Sasuke with a stiff tint of pink on her cheeks. "Do you think you can walk me home, Sasuke-kun?" Sasuke mentally winced. It was scary how girls could go from raging at their best friends to sweet and calm. Sure." He looked over towards Aiko, who was staring at the pinket. Sakura looked a bit disappointed. It seemed like Aiko had seen through his white lie. He honestly had no clue if the girl liked him like that. He had only said it to win. But he wouldn't have, he didn't know that there was a small possibility that she possibly liked him. A twinge of guilt tugged at him as Aiko waved goodbye and headed towards the Uchiha estate. "Aiko, how about you walk Sakura-chan home?" The girl seemed to perk up at this, and Aiko complied, pulling a grin on his face. Naruto lay in his bed looking up at the popcorn ceiling. He was seriously considering just asking his mom if he could stop hiding. He had seen Sasuke and it seemed like the whole world stopped. Sasuke was here with his family. There was that part of him that wanted to tackle the Ravenet and scream at him about everything that happened. But he remembered that was a different Sasuke and that he was a different Naruto. He was still a bit worried that he wouldn't be accepted. Of course he had had the same problem before, but this time was different. He could start over. But there was another problem. "That doppelganger of yours, Kit, he's going to cause some trouble." Naruto swallowed hard. "Those coordinates though, why would he go there? I mean, does it mean that they extracted his part of the Kyuubi?" "I'm guessing so, and he probably died from it like Gaara, but without Ichigo to save him." "But they're 6 years too early," Naruto said, confused. "It's a whole different world, Naruto." Naruto sighed up at the ceiling. "So I'd have to save Gaara now. But how do I even reach him? If I remember correctly, he's pretty homicidal right now. Back then we were friends." Flipping to his side, he closed his eyes. "I don't mean to put any pressure on you, but what about the Author Jinchuriki? If anything, you'd have to get to the Mizukage now since he's most likely under Madara's influence." Naruto frowned. So he needed to gather all of the Jinchuriki, try to save Sasuke again, and stop Madara again. This is going to be one hell of a journey. Minato trekked up the stairs, finally happy to actually make it to the summit. He was cold and quite tired and was wishing he could be home with his son and wife at the moment, but whatever matters the Raikage had to discuss, he was hoping it wasn't anything to do with war. He didn't need another one to make its way to him, especially with all the good things happening to him. The door was guarded heavily, but I went in, who looked at him with cold scowls. He simply ignored them though, knowing that engaging in any hostile way could possibly mean another war. The guards opened the door for him and Kakashi still giving him harsh glares. He noticed how everyone was there already. His eyes darted straight towards the unfamiliar face at the table. He had noticed everyone except for the Mizukage. The young boy sat tall, looking regal. His pale purple eyes reminded him so much of the Hyuga as he had questioned if it was the Bakugan. However, he quickly let the thought leave his head as he took a seat besides the Kazukiage, which he was not exactly happy with, and seeing the Kazukiage expression, he wasn't too happy either. "So everyone is here, let's start the meeting." The Raikage said and looked over at the young Mizukage. Minato was still surprised at how young he looked. "Mizukage, what would you like to share with the other cages?" Minato frowned. He had guessed this meeting was about whatever quarrels the Raikage had with everyone in this room, and he was hoping he'd be able to settle his with the man. Possibly create a truce of some sort. but he still listened to what the boy had to say. "I'll get this straight to the point," he said dully. "I am the container of the Sanbi Biju." Minato's breath slightly hitched in his throat, but he didn't throw any rude glances to the boy like the Kazukiage had done. He knew how that burden had affected his wife and his son. "And because of this I have a link with the other Biju. However, that link has been tainted." He said the last word a bit bitterly. "Something is wrong with one of the Biju. Why should it be of concern to us?" The Tsukikage snapped. Minato had half the mind to rip the man's beard off his face. The Mizukage gave the Tsukikage a stoic look, as if showing some sort of dominance and temperament. "The link shows that one Biju has disappeared, which wouldn't be of concern if it wasn't for the nature of the disappearance." "So?" the Kazukiage asked, his arms folded against his chest. "Isn't it a good that a Biju disappeared?" The Mizukage rolled his eyes. "It's a concern because if a Biju disappears then it should also be gone along with the Jinchuriki." "This sounds like nonsense," the Tsuchikage said. "Once again, why is it a concern to us?" "It's a concern because a Biju's power should not just disappear off the face of the earth. It means someone took it and is plotting to use it in one way or another. Meaning that if you don't protect the Jinchuriki, so this is some lousy attempt at getting us to protect those demons." "PFFT, Mizukage, please don't embarrass yourself any further." The Tsuchikage snapped and turned his nose away from the group. "I believe a break is needed." The Kages nodded and stood from their seats. The Reikage looked slightly worried but headed out with his guards. Minato stayed seated as he looked over the Mizukage. He wondered if this had something to do with Naruto. "Mizukage-sama." The Mizukage looked up at Minato a bit flustered. "Which Biju went missing?" The boy looked shocked at the question, but gave the Hokage a very brazen smirk, which made Minato shiver slightly. "I think you know, Hokage-sama," was all he said before he got up on his own and walked out. Minato looked over to Kakashi, who looked very confused. In one way or another he'd have to tell his student of Naruto's return. Sighing, he himself got up and thought of a plan. He would have to convince the rest of the Kages to believe the Mizukage. Naruto sighed as he returned to his room. It had been a couple of days since he had seen Sasuke, and he was surprised that the raven-haired boy hadn't noticed him the bed or the fact that he walked out of the room. It was bittersweet seeing his best friend again. However, it was more sweet than bitter. Since he was with Itachi and his mother, to which Naruto had never seen. Seeing them had restored hope in Naruto. It would be easier to save Sasuke this time because he had his family. He wasn't out looking for revenge. However, a big problem crossed his mind and he frowned. But first he needed to get to those coordinates. He had come here to fix things and his doppelganger seemed more than eager to lead him to the right path. But it was risky for him to go when he wasn't up to par on his training, though it seemed urgent. He knew where he'd be going, but what exactly would he be looking for? His doppelganger had said that they'd be trying to get his half of the Kyuubi. So that had meant that his doppelganger had had the other half of the Kyuubi, right? Or was the Kyuubi sealed into someone else and his doppelganger just so happened to know who it was? It was also very confusing. He couldn't be sure that things were the same here. Although he was glad Sasuke had his family, he couldn't be sure if Itachi was going to try and kill them later on. He also couldn't be sure if Itachi was going to join the Akatsuki. And he also had to find Gaara and Yonde Mizukage-sama. What was his name? Igura, idiot. Naruto frowned at nothing in particular. When he had met the Mizukage Oyugaru-sama, the boy, man, wait. Which one was he again? He asked a fox within him and he could just see the demon rolling his eyes. The one you insulted by calling him weak and saying that he never kissed a girl. Ah, yes. Oh, that Yugaru-sama. You still don't remember him, do you? Nope. Naruto sighed to himself and tried to remember exactly what he looked like. Naruto didn't remember insulting anyone, but then again he was oblivious to a lot of things. His father had been gone for at least a week and he wondered what the summit was all about. He only hoped it wasn't another declaration of war. He just got to this world and didn't need to hide in Giant Turtle for a good portion of the war. His training with his mother went well. He was able to get in a few hits here and there and the wind in his hand had stopped hurting and it just became a numb feeling. His mother had also taught him her technique to manipulating the earth. It was extremely harder than wind since it wasn't exactly in his blood to control the earth. The only thing he could do was throw little rocks, much to his dismay. However, it was progress and progress was always good. However, he was getting tired of lunging around the estate. Reading information in the library had become dull and Fuinjutsu was becoming a bore since his mother didn't know the exact extent of his Fuinjutsu abilities. So he was becoming restless. He wanted to go out and finally see his friends, he wanted to taste Ichiraku ramen, he wanted to do a lot of things. But couldn't since no one knew he was alive. So he would bother his mother about going out tomorrow. It was most likely because he lived for the outdoors and if he was cooped up inside all day, he'd wither away from not having any contact with the outside world. He was really hating being kept a secret but knew that it was better this way. Although it wouldn't stop him from griping and complaining about it. Please mom. I can hinge or something please. He begged, taking a liking to his mother leg. He knew his mother wrath, but he didn't mind taking a couple of hits if it meant getting to train at a training ground. Alone. By himself, which meant he didn't have to hold back anymore. I swear I won't go out into the village. Kushina sighed and gave Naruto a hard glare. Her son was one persistent boy and she guessed she passed that off to him. However, she didn't believe she was one to hold on to people's legs like a toddler who didn't want their parents go away for the evening. This is going to be a good story to tell his girlfriend. She thought. Naruto, I already told you no. You can't hinge for the whole duration of training. Naruto's eyes flickered with that familiar emotion Kushina got whenever Mikoto-san and her family came over for dinner. No. She stated firmly, and Naruto gave her a knowing mischievous smile. I'm not going to let you drain yourself out of chakra. Naruto didn't let that stop him though. He hugged his mother's leg tighter. But I promise not to let anyone see me. He said in a whiny voice. And I'll let you check in whenever you want to. Blinking at the last proposition, Kushina sighed slightly. She wouldn't be able to check in for a long while since she had a lot to do. She was the Hokage's wife after all. Just because she didn't wear the hat didn't mean she didn't indulge in some of the duties it came along with. Alright, but you have to stay hinged for the entire duration of training. Naruto popped up off the ground beside his mother leg and hooted. Alright, let's get going, Dadabayo. Kushina looked over to Naruto a bit astonished. He had gotten her verbal tick. She too gave a hoot and they headed out ready to take on the new day. Naruto hinged into a boy who looked about 16 years old. The way Naruto was able to change even his attitude in a hinge was impressive. The boy, who had red hair and pale green eyes and no eyebrows, she noted, gave out a weird aura. Like he would snap you half if you even gave a menacing look his way, but help you if you were in any type of danger. She wondered if Naruto knew this boy in his other dimension. Naruto snickered on the inside as people deliberately walked out of the way for him. He was walking around Konoha as Gaara. Even though it was odd for him to pick the Kazekage, he couldn't exactly think of a creative face. So he chose someone that nobody met, hopefully. Of course he wasn't going to stay as Gaara throughout all his time training. He just needed to think of a face and the hair color and the eye color and the age and the size and a whole bunch of things. They walked quickly down the village, but Naruto reveled in every moment. A lot of things were different and he meant a lot. Shops he'd never seen before were placed in shops he'd once been to. Some statues that looked pretty darn old were set in places he'd never seen. In this dimension, Konoha had two huge parks. One was a memorial one, which he had been, and the other was an off-duty park, which was meant only for ninjas who were off-duty who were spending time with their families. You had to have a hit IA to enter the park. Here we are narrow, I mean boy. Kushina said, giving Naruto a wink. The boy couldn't help but sweat drop at how his mother was acting. I will allow you to use your Minato's training field. Don't talk to strangers and don't do something stupid. She warned. Naruto nodded his head and his mother leaned in, giving him a peck on the forehead. I love you boy. His mother then scurried, leaving Naruto to direct himself to the training ground. Training ground 26. He said, muttered softly to himself. He remembered long ago when he used training ground 13 for Team 7 and after the war he used it mostly for himself. It was odd using a different one, but then again he never got his own. Training grounds were usually owned by one person. And that person, if they became a sensei, had to use the open training ground or theirs to accommodate the students because the students weren't old enough for their own and weren't of high enough rank or didn't have the money to get one. You needed to be at least 16 to buy one for yourself, with parental consent, however that in itself cost too much money. So usually students waited until they passed the Chunin exams to get their own. It would be small, but they could build on it later. He remembered the first time he saw Kakashi-sensei's training ground. Kakashi didn't trust Team 7 enough to show them his training ground at first. And he guessed the silver-haired man had every right to do so. But then he remembered when he went to train for his wind deficiency. It was nothing like the first one he went to. And although he didn't really notice it then, he had really wished he had. Kakashi saved up a ton of money just to add a waterfall to his training ground. He couldn't imagine all the money being taken out of his frog wallet. Just the thought made him cringe. As he reached the entrance ground, Naruto rehinged into a more believable person. Although Gaara was real, he didn't think anyone would believe him if he had said he was from Konoha. So he did the simplest thing and formed into a boy he'd seen in many of his visions. He knew he shouldn't have, but that boy was like the perfect image of a person from Konoha. Oh, really? How about I sit beside you? We can talk about Sakura-chan. Of course, since Naruto was dense he didn't think anyone would notice him. Aiko, what are you doing here? Naruto turned his head to the boy now approaching him. Kiba? He asked calmly. The dog boy gave a big wolf-like grin. Ah, so you're training up too. Did you hear about the academy too? Naruto practically felt like face-palming. Should have stick with the whole Gaara act. Yeah. He replied hesitantly. He wondered what happened to the academy. He honestly hoped it wasn't anything bad. We'll train hard and show Iruka-sensei what we've got. Do you want to join the rest of gang? Kiba asked, not exactly seeing Naruto's confused face. I think it'd be best if Aiko-san, a deep monotone voice said, cutting him off. Even at young age he had such a deep voice. Naruto looked at the boy with a bit of reluctance. He knew that he had also teased the boy about him being so forgettable because of his formality and the way he seemed to blend in with a shadow. However, it was nice seeing him again. It was nice seeing the both of them again, and knowing that he was starting over, Naruto gave the boy a big grin. Shino. Inoichi sighed as he walked into his office. He really couldn't believe the week he was having. It was still snowing, but not as much as before, and Ino had had a pretty bad fever because she had stayed out in the snow when he told her not to. Of course, she was coming to that age where she'd be defiant. He'd heard horror stories of those times, and when Ino was little he really didn't believe it would happen, but now he wasn't so sure. Sitting in his desk chair, Inoichi looked over the papers and thought about the bizarre thing that happened only 2 weeks ago. The blonde Naruto appeared. He'd had sworn to secrecy to never tell anyone about Naruto, including Ibiki and Shizune. However, he wondered what the Hokage had planned to do. The blonde Naruto was obviously his son, and he knew Minato knew that. He just wondered if Minato would send Naruto to the academy again and see all of his friends. He knew Ino missed Naruto, and that all his other friends did too. Just because there was a slight change in appearance didn't mean that he wasn't Naruto. Sighing, he looked on his desk for something to work on, possibly the newest case of all the suspicious snakes they found around the memorial park. That had been one hell of a problem. However, he wondered if someone did it as a sick joke. Orochimaru-san hadn't been MIA for only a few months, and someone did something cruel like that. It made him shiver. He knew that a lot of people believed that the Snake Sannin had some weird plan to end Konoha, however there was no proof, so they had no reason to spout such claims. Besides, the Sannin was practically dead since there was no sign of him. Looking through his papers, Inoichi frowned as he picked up a brown package. He didn't remember anyone saying they had given him a package. He wordlessly looked over it and saw it had "For your fox" written on the box. There was no sender. He carefully opened the box and pulled out a plastic bag. Inside the plastic bag was a hit I-8 and some type of robe of some sort. Along with plastic bag was a pouch that looked extremely worn out. He opened it and 2 sealed 3-pronged kunai came out, along with little papers that had seals on them. Inoichi was startled by this. The only person in Konoha known to have 3-pronged kunai was the Yondaime-sama. He placed the kunai back into the pouch and also put the seals into the pouch. He then stuffed everything inside the box. He believed that whoever sent the box was meaning to give it to Minato. He needed to get the box to Hokage-sama. Naruto eyed Shino and Kiba with slight confusion as they headed to a whole different training ground. So far he knew that Kiba and Shino were training for the academy because it had been closed down for snow days. They were also meeting up with other people. He would see the rest of the gang and possibly be able to train at a high level. But not as high as he was at the current moment, and that made him slightly mad. I'll train you later, kid. Now you have to figure out what's going with all your friends. Naruto followed the 2 boys as they entered a training ground. Naruto practically gaped at the size of it. Someone pretty damn rich had to hook this place up. Or someone who was an awesome ninja who used their pure awesomeness to build the place. There was enough space for 2 whole academy classes to train there without having to worry about someone being up in there could see all the weapons they had. Which was a lot. However, it lacked something to make it really awesome, possible a giant waterfall. Which Naruto couldn't tell what, but he didn't really mind. Hey, you brought Aiko with you? Naruto felt a lump form in his throat when he saw the pink hair and green eyes looking at him with a small smile. He gave the girl a small wave, not sure how Aiko would really greet Sakura-chan. The boy had only been in a few of his visions. He missed Sakura, he really did, and was glad she didn't change one bit. Her hair was even as short as it was when she cut it. He could remember it being pretty long before, but now it was at her shoulders. Sakura looked a little hesitant but waved back shyly. Oh, I know that move all too well. Naruto said to himself, smirking mentally. Yep. Kiba said, and Naruto had noticed that Kiba didn't have his dog with him. Where's Akamaru? Naruto asked. Kiba whined slightly and crossed his arms over his chest. He's with Hana so he could get treated. Naruto's eyes almost bulged out. Wow, what happened? Kiba looked over at Naruto a bit amused and confused. I meant he's getting groomed. Gosh, didn't I tell you this, Ichiha? Naruto halted at the last sentence Kiba said. Ichiha. So Naruto, right now, was pretending to be an Uchiha great. He had no clue what this guy's efficiency was. He was able to use fire jutsus, but he had no idea if the kid did any of his fire jutsus. Was the kid's second efficiency wind? He sure did hope so, but he wouldn't blow his cover like that. He'd stick to the fire and leave the rest out. Naruto had proven, in his other dimension, to have 3 efficiencies. His primary being wind, his secondary being lightning, and his last being fire. But this kid could be all about fire and earth, or worse yet water. Naruto sighed and looked over to Sakura who looked bored. So when are the others coming? He asked to anyone who would answer. Ino should have been here 5 minutes ago, Shikamaru will be late as will Choji, and Sasuke-kun should be here any moment. Sakura answered dully. Naruto noticed how Sakura's eyes didn't light up anymore when she said Sasuke's name. He knew that she had always seemed to get happy when anything happened in her life had been about Sasuke when they were younger. But it seemed as if he wasn't that important. But the girl does have a thing for this Aiko character. Naruto had noticed that. If someone told him that Sakura liked someone named Aiko in the first place he'd been astonished, since Aiko was a girl's name and all. He'd be astonished either way actually because she was so in love with Sasuke. Sorry I'm late guys, my dad practically grounded me. Ino's voice filled in the silence that had once been there. She put her pouch down on a bench and looked up. Where's Sasuke-kun? Naruto smiled slightly. Ino seems to still have her crush for the team still intact. He waited for someone to answer Ino, but soon blushed when he realized that she was talking to him. That's right I henged as an Uchiha. He should be on his way. It sounded more like a question, but the blonde girl rolled with it. They waited a bit longer until Shikamaru and Choji came. When they came Kiba decided that Sasuke could suck it and they started without him. Naruto was paired to go against Shino, and Naruto found this perfect. He had never fought Shino before, but he knew that the bug boy was all about long distance, just like his mom. If he could somehow get up close and personal for just a few minutes, then maybe he could use the tactic against his mom. Kiba had paired with Choji and Ino was against Sakura. Shikamaru happily accepted the fact he didn't have a partner to spar against, and lazy sat on one of the benches. To Naruto's surprise, when Shikamaru said that they could start, Shino was the one to attack first. A huge army of bugs popped up from below him and he could have easily dodged it, but he didn't. Was Aiko good at being fast and getting away from attacks? Or did he take the hits and give some of his own punches? He really wished he could just ask, hey guys, what am I good at when I fight? Am I fast and evasive, or am I more up close and personal? Also what are my efficiencies if any of you know what those are yet? He huffed out a breath. Yeah right like that was going to happen. He hopped into the air and quickly, possibly a bit too quickly, did the hand signs for the famous Uchiha technique. Fireball jutsu. Shino, just in time dodged the attack and sent another wave of bugs his way. Naruto not sure if he should dodge or take the hit, did another fireball jutsu that burned away the bugs. As his feet touched the ground he ran towards Shino and did some basic taijutsu. He collided a punch to Shino's chin and the boy flew back some. In the visions he had of Aiko the boy seemed a bit cocky, but he didn't know if he rolled that way in battle. He knew that not everyone kept the same attitude on the battlefield. The taijutsu seemed too basic and Shino easily kicked him back doing more long-distance jutsus. Naruto felt screwed, he really did. If he wanted to he could just slap a Rasengan up in Shino's face and be down with the whole fight and head back and do some real training. If he knew Aiko's fighting style he also would be able to take on Shino, but he just couldn't do anything. And it annoyed the crap out of him. So, he decided to dodge Shino's attacks until the teammate member got tired. And the plan worked, to his great surprise. He was easily judging everyone's work and could see how weak they were. That's how weak he was. In 2 years they'd be doing the Chunin exam and he wondered how any of them, including himself, survived. Because quite frankly they sucked. Sakura and Ino's taijutsu were sloppy and they got out of form so many times Naruto couldn't even count. Kiba and Choji basically repeated the same moves until they were too tired to continue. 5-minute break. Choji breathed out. Naruto looked over to the Akimichi member and saw as he sat beside Shikamaru who was eyeing him suspiciously. Shit. An alarm went off in Naruto's head as he saw the Nara. How could Naruto be so stupid? Shikamaru would catch on so quickly it wasn't funny. He was a Nara after all. He probably noticed as soon as he walked in. Naruto, not wanting to become even more suspicious, gave a hearty and rough laugh. Guys thanks for the training session, but I've gotta go. He said hastily and headed out of the training ground and ran as fast as he could to the place he was supposed to have been. Shikamaru glared as Aiko's figure disappeared out of the hall. Did something seem off about him to you guys? He asked his group friends. Ino nodded and frowned slightly. Usually he's flirting with me and Sakura like crazy. Sakura agreed with a hum. And he's usually bragging about how he'll beat me. Kiba said pulling a frown on his face too. Shino added. And he usually doesn't dodge attacks. Shikamaru had seen all of this, but most importantly the one thing that set him off was that the Uchiha hadn't done some mock version of Sasuke like he always done in memory of their great friend Naruto. Naruto and Aiko would always mock Sasuke before sparring because the Ravenet was so stuck up. Shikamaru sighed. Well whatever it is, ladies and gentlemen be amazed. Because Aiko Uchiha is here. Shikamaru blanched slightly as did everyone else. Sasuke, who was with him rolled his eyes. No one cares. He said in an apathetic voice. Aiko pouted slightly and saw the look on everyone's face. But you were just here. Sakura said and Ino agreed. You just ran off Aiko, were you messing with us? Ino said, the demand for an answer was deep in her voice. Aiko looked utterly confused and so did Sasuke. What are you guys talking about? The Uchiha asked as Sasuke placed his pouch on the bench beside Ino's. Never mind, it's troublesome. Shikamaru said, but he was utterly curious now. What had just happened? Ashina was just about done handing out all the invitations to the dinner she was hosting in a few days. Her husband would be back along with Uraya and Obito. That meant that she had a bit more time preparing about what she was going to say and to prepare Naruto. She knew she should tell Minato about the plan, so once he got back she'd ask him if it was alright to use this approach. She honestly wondered where Jiraiya and Obito were. If anything they should be back in Konoha by tomorrow. She did expect them 2 days ago though. She sincerely wondered what kept them away for so long. Obito glared daggers and the old buffin who was smiling his idiotic perverted smile. Did we really have to stop at 3 towns for you to do your stupid research? Obito hissed at the man. Jiraiya only nodded his head while humming, dry blood was evident under his nose. Obito had wondered to himself why a very powerful ninja, who was a legend, was such a pervert. Maybe he was just really lonely growing up, yeah right. There's no excuse for such perverted actions. Damn pervert. Jiraiya glared at the Uchiha. That's super pervert to you. Naruto huffed out a breath as he lay on the floor completely exhausted. He had just finished trying to alternate the Bijuu bomb in some way for him to do it without relying on the fox's chakra. However, that was proving to be useless since he had to go into Bijuu and Sage mode to do it. The fox had said that he needed to take away a little of his chakra away every time so that he could only do it Sage mode. It wouldn't be as big, but it would an alternate option from the Rasengan. He was only able to do 2 so far, but found that even after he did 2 dumbed down versions of the Bijuu bomb, he still had enough chakra to create clones. Alright, you guys. Since I have the chance now I need you to find some people for me. Naruto said to his clones. The 3 clones nodded their heads. You, find Yugura-sama and try to convince him about the Akatsuki without hinting anything about me. You go find Gaara and make sure to befriend him. Okay boss. The 2 clones said and sprinted off. Naruto looked to the last clone and sighed. He had no clue if this would work, but seriously hoped it would. Try and find Tsunade Bachin. She should be where we last found her. But since Shizune-chan isn't with her I'm not exactly sure. The clone nodded but hesitated for a moment. What do you want me to tell her? Try and get her to come back to Konoha, you know. At least get her to think about Konoha and if she should come back. The clone nodded his head and ran off. Naruto knew that after that training session he'd have to lay low on using chakra. Which meant he wouldn't be training for a few days. This is just great. He hissed and waited for his mother to come back. He wouldn't be able to walk on his own and he wasn't ready for the scolding she was going to give him. The sun rose above the tower where the cages rested making the tower illuminated in light. There were no clouds inside and the sun shone brightly but the brisk wind told a different story. Minato woke with the chilly air consuming the room he slept in. An Anbu stood guard at his door ready for any attack and Minato sighed in relief. Morning Inu, he greeted from his sleeping bag. The Anbu gave a curt nod. Good morning Hokage-sama. His formalities kicked in straight away, but Minato waved him off. I may be Hokage, but I'm also your sensei. It's just Minato. Minato gave him a small smile and got to his feet. Besides, I still haven't gotten used to it. The dog Anbu stayed silent for a while before shaking his head. It is mandatory that I give you respect and such respect demands formalities. I'm not Obito, Hokage-sama. Would it help if I said that I'd make you do D-rank missions? It does not affect me. With academy students. Even through the dog mask Minato could feel the glare his student gave him. With his arms down by his sides, very close to his weapons pouch. His legs parted and a killer intent radiated off of him easily. If Minato didn't know any better he'd say the dog nin was ready to kill him. Fine, then Minato-sensei. Minato couldn't help but smile at the Anbu. Rolling up his sleeping bag he looked around the room. It was practically all bare. The floors were wood with small holes in them. The walls were wood too, but at least whoever made it had the decency to paint it. A window, which he noticed a certain dog nin must have opened, occupied itself by the back wall. There was a small kitchen, which had very fine china, but no food. Minato found it absurd that no one occupied the small homes the cages stayed in after they left the summit. What a waste of space. He muttered to himself and straightened his back and stretched. In the next few minutes he quickly got ready by taking a hot shower and got dressed. He then headed out to the summit. The cold wind that blew around them made Minato shiver. Konoha wasn't even this cold when it was snowing. The trek to the large tower took less than 5 minutes and was in complete silence. The dog Nin never talked much and when he did he was usually responding to what someone else had said. Minato at some points in time wished that Dignin was more like Obito when it came to these situations. He never liked the quiet that surrounded him, especially when such a pressing manner was ahead of him. His thoughts were his worst enemies at this time. Yondaime Hokage, the meeting has not started yet. Only Yondaime Mizukage and Yondaime Reikage have appeared. Minato gave the man, who seemed incapable of being a shinobi but more like an advisor, a curt nod. And just as she said, the Reikage and the Mizukage sat with worried looks on their faces. "Hokage-sama, we have much to discuss," the Reikage said, greeting him by standing. The Mizukage followed the Reikage actions, but his demeanor was way off from the day before. His eyes were bloodshot and it looked as if he hadn't slept for the whole night. His eyes wandered off, never looking Minato in the eye. Each village had a bone to pick with each other and for a good 3 days they had bickered on and off. Minato found their issues of no importance to him because Yugura-sama had presented the most pressing issue at hand for them, but no one would listen. It was like trying to tell a wall to move before the tornado hit. Utterly useless. Minato, and Yugura had talked about their own matters privately, but Yugura always seemed more the peaceful when they talked. But now he seemed as if he'd been visited by a ghost. Minato sat in his seat and the dog Nin stood behind him. "Mizukage-sama, are you alright?" The concern that dripped from his voice was nothing but real, and the young man winced when he spoke. It seemed as if Yugura was having a hard time believing that he actually cared. "Yes, Hokage-sama. It was just a rough night." Yugura's eyes wandered off to look at the horseshoe wooden table. He seemed content with his eyes staying there. "However, I do suggest we meet up after the other cages have their pointless ramblings." The Mizukage sighed, but the stress did not leave his face, and for a long while Minato was left to wonder what happened on that night. Hokage, Mizukage, Reikage. I believe this will be our last day for these meetings. I hope you hear me out." The Tsuchikage walked quickly to his seat and gave each cage not really a sympathetic look, but a threatening look. It was then that the Kazekage walked in, not saying anything and displaying any emotion on his face. His issues had solely been with the Mizukage. Even with a son who was a Jinchuriki himself, the Kazekage stubbornly refused to listen. And Tsuchikage would disagree anyway just because Minato agreed. And Iwagakure and Konohagakure had never really been friends. So which matter should we discuss first? Minato asked as if daring the 2 others to bring up their selfish qualms. Minato really hated the fact that they only attended the whole summit not to hear others out, but to bicker about their own selfish ideas. "I will ask once more that you please listen to my reasoning as to why you need to concern your thoughts with the Biju." Despite his dead, tired look, the Mizukage kept an air of professionalism about him. He rested his chin in his palm and cocked his head at the Kazekage. "Our villages have had too many qualms for too long. If we let our personal feelings get in the way of things, all of the people we swore to protect would be dead in a few years." Yugura-sama narrowed his head at the Tsuchikage. "So either hear me out or see to it that war may be declared in a few years." Minato had to hold in his breath because he did not expect that. "Mizukage-sama, I don't believe." The young Kage, with all his air of professionalism, put his hand up and Minato instantly shut his mouth. He really didn't like the way a boy younger than him was so elegant in what he did that even putting his hand up made Minato stop talking to reason with him. Because war was an awfully big threat. "Don't assume I am the one declaring war," he said dryly. "Ha! Such a child making such threats. What proof do you have that our actions may be the cause of war?" the Kazekage asked coldly. His eyes were narrowed at the young Kage, but Yugura didn't even flinch. "I'm not saying that whether or not you decide to hear me out will or will not result in war. War will come either way. Mizukage, you have made your case, however I would like to see this proof too," the Reikage said with a pained look. The idea of war was now set on all of their minds. Minato's village had already suffered a huge blow with the 3rd Great Shinobi War. He didn't need another one terrorizing every generation. He didn't want Naruto to be put through that. But Naruto now brought up a new question in his mind. The Kyuubi. Did Naruto still have the Kyuubi in him? Did this Naruto even know about the demon that had terrorized his wife and then the son he had lost? Yugura-sama sighed and shook his head violently. "Only Jinchuriki who have a close connection with their Biju can." Close connection? That Tsuchikage stood up with a ragged look on his face. "You mean to tell me that you have to get close to a demon? I may as well believe you sold your soul to the Shinigami." Minato winced when he heard that line. It was like hearing someone say that to his son. What if people talked like that to his son? Calling him a demon and saying he conspired with the Shinigami himself. Minato frowned and looked over at the Tsuchikage with a dark glare. "You're a very sorry man, Tsuchikage." He spat without giving the man a proper suffix at the end of his name. "Either you and the Kazekage will agree to help us figure what is going on, or you and Kazekage will be left bewildered once the day comes that something bad does happen. You've seen what the Biju can do, you've seen what they've done to your people. Do not let your personal beliefs blind you from seeing reason." The Tsuchikage looked at him with a shocked look but kept his mouth closed. "If anything," the Kazekage started. He seemed to be listening to Minato. I shall consider your proposition. However, I have spent too much time here and need to return to my village." He stood up abruptly and quickly walked out of the room. "I too shall consider it," but Tsuchikage said. His eyes were downcast and he quickly left from the horseshoe table. Once the older man was out of sight, Yagura let out a sigh and gave Minato a small smile. "Thank you, Hokage-sama, Reikage-sama," he said, and he himself stood up. "If anything, shall we continue our discussion from yesterday?" Minato nodded, as did the Reikage. It was odd because Minato and the Reikage never really got along. But they both had one thing in common. They had people they loved who were Jinchuriki and they wanted to protect them. Naruto yawned loudly as he looked around his room. For the past 3 days he had been resting his body because Biju bombs were very straining. His chakra had replenished, but his body was very sore. When his mother found him, she had gone off on him about being so irresponsible and how she'll never let him train again unless he was supervised. And then he'd seen his friends. It was a great big chunk of the Konoha 12 that had been there. Fighting against Shino, however, he was sure that they, mostly Shikamaru, were suspicious of him. He had not known a single thing about the Uchiha he had pretended to be unintentionally. Although he suspected he must have been very brooding, possibly because that's how Sasuke was. The other Uchihas he knew were practically just downright mocking and asses. Well, besides Itachi. Itachi had been more of a mystery. He really didn't show any emotion, however when he talked to Sasuke about the Uchiha he had said he was caring, and Naruto guessed with a little time he spent with Itachi that he had been caring. For Sasuke at least. "Naruto." His mother screamed and suddenly barged into his room. Her hair flew like it was possessed and her eyes glowed a dark crimson. Naruto gulped and put his hands up in defense. "What did I say about the toilet seat?" "Ah, yeah, that was right. The toilet seat." He had forgotten to put it down because he hadn't ever lived with anyone else besides the week he stayed with Lee. Which was a very odd time. But Lee never complained about him putting down the toilet seat. Put it down when you are finished." His mother screamed and gave his head a solid punch. He cried out and rubbed his head. Sorry." He bit out, his eyes slightly watering because his mother was so terrifying. Her aura was so threatening. Sorry isn't going to cut it, mister. I tell you day in and day out that you have to keep that in mind." She sighed, her aura becoming more calm. "So to make up for it, I'm taking you shopping." And Naruto thought this was planned because she never talked to him about shopping before. If anything, after he became Rakudame he always had clothes specially tailored. He'd tell his tailor to make the same outfit for him because he wasn't picky about his clothing. So he never really went shopping, and even before then he'd only buy the same outfit that was considerably cheap so he didn't have to go back. And that was mostly because the shopkeepers never really liked him. "But he whined, why do I need to go shopping? I have enough clothes already." "Well, Naruto, I'm having a dinner in a few days with some of the clan heads and I need to get you some formal wear." But Naruto was concerned about this new information. "I'm not supposed to be here." His mom stiffened slightly and looked down at him with a worried look. "What are talking about, Naruto?" And Naruto soon remembered that he wasn't supposed to know about the retired Naruto here. He remembered that he was supposed to be completely oblivious to the fact that another Naruto even lived here. Let alone know how he died. Isn't there another Naruto here? Isn't that why I hinged?" Ashina's eyes sparkled with sadness, but her lips twitched up into a small smile. Her anger now seemed years away. "Naru-chan," she started slowly. She sat down on his bed so that they were at the same height level. "In our world, you disappeared. That's why I had you henge. But, we found you." Her smile slowly got bigger and Naruto felt like hurling out his stomach. He wasn't the same Naruto though. "We just want to show all those people that believed you were gone that we found you." She pressed a kiss on his forehead and Naruto had to bite back the feeling of pushing her away. He loved his mother, but this was a whole different dimension he went to. He wasn't supposed to be here, it was not his place. A different Naruto was supposed to be here. He couldn't stop the thoughts that entered his mind about people not accepting him. All his friends not wanting to be his friend because someone else had taken his place before he got here. "Now Naruto," his mother said with a sudden happy demeanor. "Get dressed and go ahead and henge. We can't stay out too long." She sang and headed out of his room. Naruto frowned and closed the door all the way. He really didn't want to go shopping, especially after being plunged so deep into his thoughts. Although his body was still sore, he did the hand signs and in less than a second a doppelganger of himself appeared out of nowhere. "What you need, boss?" he asked with a serious face. "I'm gonna need you to take my place for a few days, just don't do any training with mom and don't get into any danger." The clone looked more than a little annoyed. "So I have to go shopping and pretend to be me. Look, it'll be for like what? Only 2 days. And why am I even asking you, you're me." "Yeah, but still, you won't be here." The clone pouted and pulled out clothes from the closet. Naruto rolled his eyes. Sometimes he hated the fact that clones acted just like him. Whatever, I'll leave a backup clone so you can go poof by tomorrow. Naruto grabbed a whole bunch some comforting clothing, good for training and relaxing, and hinged quickly. He placed the clothes on his body and snuck out of his room. He could hear his mother humming a song and smiled softly at that because it wasn't something he was used to, but something he'd cherish. He opened one of the bigger windows, since his was too small to sneak out from, and headed out being as stealthy as possibly, knowing Anbu were watching the perimeter of the estate. Just a little time to myself, that's all I need. Jiraiya and Obito finally arrived at the gates of Konohagakure, and Obito couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. If it wasn't for the fact that they both had been assigned as a team to search for Naruto in the south perimeter of Konoha, then he would have left Jiraiya to all his research by himself. Of course though he had been lucky enough to not have the man hit on every girl with boobs he saw. Ah, Jiraiya-sama, Obito-sama. Good to have you back. Izumo and Genma greeted them with small waves. Obito waved back to them enthusiastically while Jiraiya just nodded. Calm down kid, Jiraiya chided. You're gonna break your damn arm. Obito gave Jiraiya a dark glare and placed his hand down back to his side. What right do you have to tell me about safety? You wanna be safe, huh? Then don't ogle girls with your eyes because maybe then you wouldn't lose so much blood. Pervert. Jiraiya mocked hurt and elbowed the Uchiha in the ribs. It's super pervert. Genma and Izumo looked at the two with sweat drops. They both may have seemed like they could not stand each other, but the both of them actually were very good friends. They just argued a lot. Well, I say we try and find Minato-sensei and see why he asked us to come back. Obito declared, suddenly getting serious. He really didn't like the thought of thinking that Naruto was out there completely helpless and in danger when he could have been searching for him. His sensei better have had a really good reason as to why they needed to come back. No can do, Uchiha-san. Izumo said with a shake of his head. Hokage-sama is out at a cage summit. Genma finished for Izumo. Really now? Well that is interesting. Jiraiya said calmly. Hokage summits were rare, in fact they were usually for the inauguration of a new cage, or to declare war. Jiraiya seriously hoped it was the former because he had lived through too many wars. He couldn't bear the thought of Konoha going through something like that again. Yes, but Sandaime-sama has taken the role of Hokage while he is gone. He should be in the tower. Genma said with a bored drawl. Thank you, Obito nodded towards the two shinobi, and Jiraiya quickly fell in step with him when he began to walk to the tower. The village had stayed the same, of course. However, Obito always expected it to be different. He had only been gone for a month and a week and a half, however he always expected a new shop somewhere. And or a shop to be gone. He also expected a new set of buildings to be built too, since different foreigners were beginning to migrate to their village. They stayed quiet for the whole walk to the tower, which wasn't odd because usually when Jiraiya wasn't being a pervert and Obito wasn't acting so childish they were quiet. Boy. Obito-san. Obito snapped his head up to look at the two familiar faces that appeared in front of him. Aiko was running towards him at an unbelievable pace, and Sasuke was walking with a bored look on his face. Aiko ran straight into Obito, and the Uchiha didn't even process the thought that he should have sidestepped so the little brat could run into Jiraiya. But nevertheless Aiko ran straight into him and they both tumbled to the floor. Watch where you're going, brat. Obito looked down at his clothes to see the dust they were collecting. You ruined my favorite shirt. He squealed. What are you talking about, you have like 3 pairs of that shirt. Aiko said, standing to his feet, not bothering to bat an eyelash at Obito who was still on the ground. But this one is my favorite. He whined. He practically heard Jiraiya chiding him for being so childish. Now what do you want? He snapped. Aiko's grin widened slightly and Sasuke appeared next to him, not even acknowledging him. Sasuke never did like him for some odd reason. Did you find anything? You came back pretty early from all the other times. And Obito could feel his heart sink in his stomach. His face contorted into raw pain at seeing Aiko so excited for some news that at least said that Naruto was out there, alive. Obito felt completely worthless and like a failure because he found nothing. But he hoped that someone else did. No, Jiraiya said from beside him. The white-haired Sannin was still smiling though. Although I'm pretty sure someone did because we all were called back to come back to Konoha. I'm pretty sure Hokage-sama wouldn't just pull us out for nothing. And that left Obito surprised because quite frankly Jiraiya was a jerk when he was a kid. He'd always say the worst things and tell Obito things that made him think he was just nothing. But he knew that that was how Jiraiya worked. He gave hope in a negative way. He even would go all the way to say that Obito would not amount to much if he didn't do anything and get his grades up in the academy. It was because of that that Obito was able to defend himself during the war and also of course his sensei teachings. But he guessed it made complete sense. Naruto was his godson, why would he want to tell one of Naruto's friends that his godson wasn't going to come home? That was absurd, but still it was odd seeing Jiraiya give hope in a positive way. So you guys didn't find anything? It was Sasuke who spoke, and even if the kid had a blank face his voice was dripping with disappointment. No, but someone else did. Obito said with a big smile. He had no clue if that was the actual case, but he sure did hope so. Agura looked over out the tower with worried eyes. He was the last one left and decided to stay a bit longer to think on some things. He was getting more and more worried as time went on. The link between all Biju had been odd lately. He believed before that the Kyuubi had been taken, but suddenly he could feel the chakra of the Kyuubi just late last night. And the odd thing was that the Biju had appeared weaker. He really had no clue what exactly was going to happen or why it was happening. He just hoped that the other cages listened to his warnings. Someone was planning something that included all Biju, and it was going to result in some terrible war. He knew war was what they were going to be facing just a few years. He sighed and stood from the horseshoe table, his head ducked down. "Alright Itsuki, we should depart." He was given no answer, and Yagura visibly stiffened, looking behind him. Itsuki was nowhere to be found. "What the?" "Hello, Yonde Mizukichi. It's a pleasure to meet you." Naruto scurried through the streets of Konohagakure, looking at everyone and everything. The tall buildings that he saw only days ago seemed to get taller, and the people seemed to double. In only 3 days. It was insane really. To think that this very Konohagakure, well not this one, but one so similar to it was in ruins in a whole other dimension. To think that the people of his village were living in huts in the other dimension in Sunagakure, it simply made him feel guilty. He had left believing that he could change things. He believed he could restart and save his village, along with many others, and the fate that had come to them. But instead he ended up in a world where Sasuke still had his family, the village hadn't suffered from the attack, or so he believed, and his parents were alive. If anything, the only that change was everything Naruto wanted to change, but there was no being safe in this world because the Kyuubi had been extracted from the other him. And the other him was haunting him. Out of all people his doppelganger decided to haunt his dreams and give him odd visions. Naruto always tried not to think of the guilt that built up inside his heart. His people, the people he had sworn to protect, were still out there suffering. And he'd left them, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally. He still left when he had so much more to do. And he wondered if this was how his dad felt, leaving him. He wondered if his dad felt guilty standing there looking over at him, knowing he wouldn't be there for Naruto when Naruto needed him most, and his mom. He knew his mom felt so much pain for leaving him. He could feel it when he watched her die. Her turmoil and her sadness, he felt it through his own veins that day. And when that thought he had been trying to keep out of his mind popped into his head, he just couldn't take it anymore. These weren't his parents. Hokage-sama, the Minato in this world, was not the same dad that had given up his life for Naruto. His mom wasn't the same mom that had tried to give him all the advice she could in such little time. Being here in a different universe, with the same people, but who were so different, made him feel so lost. No matter what, you still have to help. Naruto chided himself as he walked into the memorial park. The park wasn't the same as the one in his Konohagakure. The memorial park at his Konohagakure had a huge stone in the middle, with the names of shinobi and kunoichi, who had been declared Kia for the Second Great Shinobi War, on the day of Naruto's birthday and beyond that. Instead here the stones were scattered about. Some shinobi were recognized like Shadame and Nidame. They had head statues and their names were embedded into the stones. It almost looked like a place that you'd take academy students for a field trip. And Naruto snarled. It was like this world was mocking everything he'd ever known. The memorial park only mentioned recognized ninja. The names of ninja who had graciously given up their lives for their village was nowhere to be found. Sasuke had everything he had asked for back in his world, yet Naruto could see he was still bitter about something. The Uchiha still had something that wasn't as serious as hatred, but could be turned into it. He believed that if Sasuke had his family back then the Uchiha would be okay. He was obviously wrong. His mother and father, they accepted him so quickly. It seemed as if they forgot about the son they lost, and he knew this was not the truth because he still heard his mother sob at night, the son Naruto had reason to believe was dead. And when he came all of a sudden he replaced someone. All of a sudden he had his parents and damn. They had taken him in, of course after finding out he wasn't a spy. They placed him in their son's room. They gave him their son's clothes. They quickly replaced the pictures their son once had taken. It was like he was being used to fill a void. He knew Kushina-san, his mother, cared for him. But he hadn't been accepted in that place in her heart where her son was. He sank down onto the green grass which he noticed had been just washed, and he mumbled a curse under his breath because his mother hated grass stains. She's not your mother, remember. She's his mother. He bit back the bitter taste in his mouth and forced himself to smile. At least he could see them. Whether or not his parents considered him their son, in the blood and flesh. He knew they'd never tell him until they actually felt that. But until then he'd relish in the small moments he'd get with them. Tears, which he had no idea that were there, slipped off his face like butter off of a pan. He hadn't noticed he was crying. He hated crying. He left a lot of room for him to think about other things, and thinking wasn't really his forte. That's why he preferred being loud and obnoxious. That's why after he'd lost Konohagakure to the damn snake he had plunged himself into training with anyone who was willing to train. The only thing he thought about when he trained was improvement and not the failures he had done before. He hiccuped and shifted his butt on the ground since it was getting ridiculously wet and making him uncomfortable. Maybe it'd be best if you got out of here, the gruff voice inside him said, making him jump slightly. I hate that damn weeping. Besides, someone is coming. Naruto quickly got up and wiped all the tears that had slipped down his cheek. Well, he was so tangled up in his thoughts and emotions, he had no idea that his henge was beginning to disappear. So he carelessly hid himself behind a rose bush which had, thankfully, been clipped of its thorns. He wondered idly what had made Kyuubi tell him to get out of the way, but then heard two voices and decided to keep his mouth shut. It's been 2 years. We can never be sure that he's still. Please don't talk about it. You know better than to doubt it. He's Hokage-sama's son and my friend. Please don't talk like that. Both voices were ones he'd never heard before, and if the last voice never said Hokage-sama's son, then he wouldn't even strain to listen and sulk in all his emotions. But he was truly intrigued and took a chance to look at the two persons. A girl, who had short blue hair, stood in front of a boy. Her brown eyes looked slightly pleading, but she had sunk into her hip and her arms crossed over her chest as if to defend herself. Her attire was a pale green shirt that flared out onto her caprice. Her sandals were a dark blue. Please Aiko, if you do this there is a chance you won't come back. Her arm shot out to tug on Aiko's, and Naruto found himself reminded of Sakura begging Sasuke to go on a date. He scrunched up his nose. The boy, who he soon realized to be the Aiko he henged as, gave the girl a small smile. I'm sorry Mei-chan, but I have to. All the other searchers have reported back here and I'm more than certain they found nothing. The girl, Mei, pulled away from Aiko with deflated confidence. Are you taking Sasuke-chan? Naruto's ears perked up at this and he pushed himself more towards the bush. Or are you doing this alone? Aiko looked stunned suddenly but recomposed himself like all Uchihas would do. He sighed and held the bridge of his nose. Naruto expected him to glare at the girl like a true Uchiha, but instead he smiled up at her. Naruto could tell it was holding back a lot of secrets, but at the same time it was sincere. Sasuke doesn't have to be the only one to want to get him back. His voice was calm and collected, but he seemed a bit desperate to make a point, just as the girl seemed desperate to stop him from finding him. Naruto was already on the verge of feeling unwanted, which was a vaguely familiar feeling, but then a huge wave of guilt hit him. If he let Aiko go out to find him, well, not him but another him, then he'd most likely face some trouble he could not get himself out of. Although he was happy that Aiko wasn't old enough to be called a missing nin, it still didn't sit well with him. He had to stop him, but in a meaningful way that did not include breaking the kid's heart. The girl huffed out a breath and that got Naruto's attention when she backed up from him some more. Whatever, it's your life. But don't think I won't tell anyone. That threat didn't seem to faze Aiko as he only gave a bigger grin. Thanks Mei. She waved him off and left without another word. Now it was only Aiko, and Naruto saw how quickly Aiko's grin fell from his face and the boy practically sunk to the ground. His eyes heavily focused on the green grass. Naruto could see the tears that had started to fall from the boy's eyes, and soon enough after a few tears the boy was sobbing. It wasn't loud enough to hear from where he is, but his body was shaking uncontrollably and his lip was quivering. Naruto couldn't help but frown at this. All of his friends, and even people he'd never met before, were heartbroken by him being dead. It was making him shiver just thinking about the day the clan heads would come and see him. No, not him, but another version of him who they believed to be the other him. He didn't have the same red spikes the other Naruto had. He had required whisker marks at birth, the other hand. But from all the visions that he had been having of the other Naruto, they were exactly the same. The other Naruto indulged heavily in eating ramen like it'd be the last time he'd do so. The other Naruto got on the sensei's nerves at the academy, of course not as much as him, but still it was the same. The other Naruto wore orange like he was a giant target begging to be, but he didn't care. Of course his father hadn't liked the choice in color at all, and his mother only grinned in victory. They were the same persons, but just with different backgrounds in life. However, it didn't mean that Naruto could live the rest of his life living like he was that Naruto. It only meant it might be easier for other people to accept him. And maybe he could see these people as he saw them precious. So he had decided on becoming the best Naruto there ever was out there. He wasn't going to stick around here to see his friends or his parents, because at first the plan was to just fix everything. And now, since he had no idea what the Akatsuki were planning on doing, or if there even was a Akatsuki, he wasn't sure. But he'd stick to the plan, fix everything, make it a better place so that all of his friends didn't have to face a war. And maybe he could go back and fix his own world. Naruto, here. I made the head. Gaara pointed happily to his new creation and showed it to his new friend who had met yesterday. Naruto, a blonde boy with vivid blue eyes, looked up at the Sandman with awe. Wow, Gaara, he said, gaping at it. I wasn't even able to make a body. Gaara laughed earnestly and got down on his knees patting the sand. "Here, I'll show you," he said confidently, and Naruto watched him completely mesmerized. It had only been a day since they met, yet Gaara had considered him a friend. For a person his age to come up to him and ask him if he wanted to play was rare. He had never seen Naruto around, nor had he heard of him. Of course, he'd think if Naruto really wasn't new to the village he would be famous. Naruto, and he didn't know if it was a coincidence or not, looked a lot like the Yondaime Hokage. He had seen the man around his village when he came to speak with his father. They both had that spiky blonde hair and cold blue eyes, yet Naruto seemed more inviting than the Hokage. The Yondaime Hokage seemed like a man who could smile at you one moment, then have you begging for mercy the next. But Gaara didn't find the man scary, just not approachable. Oh, but Naruto. Naruto was very approachable. He smiled all the time and cracked a lot of jokes, some Gaara didn't understand, but he laughed anyways because Naruto's laugh was just so contagious. However, Gaara knew that once Naruto found out about the demon inside him he'd run. He'd go off and hide and never look at Gaara again. So he only lived in the moment because it was his first friend and quite possibly his only. Gaara easily maneuvered the sand without even touching it, making every little grain stay together. He then made it roll into a small ball, since it was only a demonstration, and clenched his fist together so it would hold. Then he released and the ball stayed intact. And just like every time he did it, Naruto clapped. "Is that a jutsu?" Naruto asked softly, eyes still on the ball Gaara had created. "How'd you do it?" Gaara bit his lip and looked down at his hands. His father had always told him not to share important secrets. He emphasized on his abilities and ahem, the beast, with anyone who wasn't Temari and Kankuro. So that meant he couldn't tell Naruto. "It's a secret," he said as moved the ball left and right. Looking up, Gaara had seen Naruto nod his head. "I see," he said and showed Gaara the palm of his head. "Then I'll show you one of my secrets." Gaara tilted his head to the side, wondering what was so secret about his woe. Gaara breathed out. Naruto was somehow manipulating chakra in its raw form. He was spinning it like a little ball in his hands, and Gaara could feel the power it emitted, and Naruto wasn't even batting an eyelash. Then Naruto touched the ball and everything changed. The little blue chakra ball broke into individual shards and spread everywhere. Gaara was so awestruck that he couldn't tear his eyes away. "Move." Naruto suddenly spoke. His eyes were concentrated on the shards in the sky, but Gaara knew he was talking to him. So Gaara quickly went away from under the shards and to the side. Naruto frowned slightly and looked slightly strained. "I need you to make a hole." And that's exactly what Gaara did. He moved the sand, including the Sandman, being careful not to touch the shards. Then Naruto placed all the shards into the hole. Gaara closed up the hole, and Naruto slightly sagged his shoulders, making Gaara think it was okay to return to Naruto's side. But little did he know that Naruto wasn't done, so when he stepped on the ground and Naruto panicked, he suddenly jumped. Naruto jumped forward to reach for Gaara. But before he knew it, a loud explosion happened from under his feet and he was falling along with Naruto. They were suddenly in somewhere dark, but the sand still fell on their faces. When they landed, Naruto lit a flame with a fire jutsu, and Gaara could just see the concern on his face. "Are you alright?" he asked. Gaara nodded his head, but a frown was evident on his face as he looked up. A big hole was so high up, but only a little of the sunlight peered through. Naruto had created a jutsu powerful enough to make that big of a hole. Gaara started to doubt his judgment about his new friend. Despite being very friendly, Naruto was always very dense. It may have been because he didn't know much about Sunagaker culture, but Gaara doubted that. And now, seeing the power the carbon copy of the Yondaime Hokage had done, he was sure he was wrong about him. Gaara had even threatened the Special Ops Force to not follow him around. Because even if Naruto had been some assassin he could have taken care of it. Now he wasn't so sure. He was stuck in a hole with a boy he had completely misjudged, well, not completely. "Let's go this way." Naruto screamed slightly and tugged on Gaara's hand as he went forward. "Wait, we're moving?" he asked, not liking the panicking feeling that had come to his chest. But he didn't let it show in his voice. We can't just stay there forever." Glaring at Naruto, Gaara pulled his hand back and frowned. "I'd rather stay and wait." Naruto looked back at him, the light in his hands wavering a bit. "Wait for what? Help? From who?" Naruto challenged with a smirk on his face, and Gaara was surprised at this. Naruto seemed thrilled, and he meant thrilled, to go on this adventure they had no idea about. But Gaara was just freaking out, on the inside of course. His face on the outside was emotionless. Gaara's father had not gotten back from the summit yet, so if he went missing nobody would know. Temari and Kankuro usually only noticed him when he made his presence clear, and they only believed him to be a monster. "Look, Gaara, I know you're scared, but I'm not scared. I'll still be here, and if there are any monsters, there aren't any monsters, then I'll just kick their asses." Temari says not to use that word, and we might even find treasure or something. How awesome would that be? Not awesome, but of course our first priority would be to find a way out so that you aren't scared as much. "I'm not scared." Naruto looked back at Gaara, and Gaara had to resist the urge to blush because it was so embarrassing. He had just showed a figment of his emotions which was really bad. He didn't even yell at Temari and Kankuro when they were annoying. But now he had yelled at Naruto, who Gaara considered to be his best friend, even though it had only been 2 days he had spent with him. Gaara was on the verge of being upset that he had been so opening and sad that he might lose his only friend because he yelled at him. Naruto, however, was smiling, and it was a very infuriating smile. One that said, "I got you to show your emotions after 2 days just being your friend, and oh, you are so totally scared." Gaara decided to be upset and pushed Naruto forward. "Fine, you want to kick monster ass and find treasure? Then we will," he said in a bored drawl. "Forget about the exit, we need to find monsters first." And Naruto looked at him as if he had grown a million heads, to which he only gave the boy a stoic look. "Alright then, Gaara." The fire in Naruto's hand had grown bigger and Naruto gave him a huge grin. "Let's go." They marched off into the dark tunnel completely clueless of what they were doing. Gaara thought that maybe Naruto knew what he was doing, but the blonde was utterly helpless as he stuck his tongue out and pointed the fire in multiple directions. "We should go this way," he declared, and he marched on that way. Gaara's face was stoic and devoid of any emotion, but after going far enough he was feeling compelled under the tunnel, and Naruto seemed the same way. Every direction that Naruto said he was going to, Gaara very much agreed. It was like something was tugging them to keep going on, as if something was begging them to find something. He just wondered exactly what could be so special that he'd also feel the need to find it. It felt like a long while that they had been walking. The tunnel seemed to get deeper and deeper and colder as they walked. It was unnerving for Gaara because every few minutes he had to remind himself that this was a boy he hadn't known long enough to trust. He always had to drag along the sand with him, and every time Naruto would declare that they were going in a new direction, quite loudly, he had to remind himself Naruto wasn't letting out a battle cry. Whether it be against him or some monster, he had to keep his sand to himself. Naruto's fire wavered slightly and he stopped abruptly in front of him and bent down, making Gaara bump into him. Naruto was unfazed by the contact and only kept his eyes on the small hole. He examined it for a long moment. "Gaara, go back," he suddenly directed. Gaara was shocked by this sudden demand, but he glared coldly at Naruto. "No." Naruto's shoulders slumped forward and he let out a sigh. Whatever was beyond that hole, Naruto had no idea what it was, or so he thought. But he could also feel the power that was on the other side. The hole was small, too small for Naruto to fit in, but it looked like he could squeeze through and get on the other side. "I can fit," he declared and squatted down next to Naruto. The blonde boy looked at him with a worried face. "Look, Gaara," he started. Concern flitted through his eyes like the fire did in his hands. "I'm a clone." Well, that was odd to say the least. Gaara frowned and poked him. "But clones don't. A shadow clone to be exact. I'll pop, and as I do, the real me will be informed that you're here and come and get you. But for now you have to go back." Naruto's usual immature form was gone, and Naruto was looking a lot like the Yondaime Hokage, his eyes hardened but not threatening, his voice demanding but not venomous. It was a scary sight to behold, even though the blonde was not declaring any threats. Gaara began to doubt himself. Maybe Naruto knew what was going on and what was beyond the wall stopping them. The tug that pulled on his stomach was scary strong at the level, and he hoped that everything was okay. But that didn't mean that he just turned back. He wanted to help his friend, not leave him behind. When Naruto's jutsu exploded, Naruto reached out to help Gaara. So he forcefully shoved the blonde to his side and squeezed into the hole. "Gaara!" Naruto called out from behind him. It wasn't an angry shout from what he'd heard before. It was a confused shout with an underlying tone of shock. "Gaara!" he called out again. This time it sounded desperate to get him to turn around. But he crawled on despite the desperate calls. He crawled down the hole, noticing how it was, thankfully, getting bigger. The call stopped altogether and Gaara was getting worried. He heard a poof and then the sound of someone whispering. Then there was a long while of silence and Gaara was thinking of turning back. "Gaara!" He heard Naruto call and he let out a breath he had no idea he was holding in. "Have you reached the other side?" "Not yet." "Alright, when you do, tell me." Gaara nodded, knowing Naruto wouldn't see him. But he hated yelling. However, Naruto didn't ask again, to his surprise. The hole was longer than he thought. If it wasn't for the structure of it, Gaara would never be able to hear the blonde check up on him. There were a few times that Gaara had to watch out because the hole had some considerably sharp parts in it. He had lost count of how many times he had cut his legs and palms because he wasn't careful enough. But it wasn't anything that the Ichibi couldn't handle. As he made his way to the end, the hole had gotten much bigger to the point where he could walk. "I'm at the end, Naruto." He called and then placed his feet on the ground, which he instantly regretted. "Huh? Great. You just stay there, okay, Gaara? I'll be there in no time." Gaara drowned out Naruto's voice as he looked at all the bodies that lay on the floor. His head was spinning at the smell of blood and flesh. But the worst thing was that they were still alive. They moaned and some were crawling towards him. He pulled back up into the hole and held his knees to his chest. "Naruto." He called out. There was an unbearable silence until he heard him call back to him and he sighed in relief. "How long do I have stay here?" he asked as one of the bodies reached up to grab him. He scrambled backwards, but the hand continued to reach out. He kicked it back and heard a groan. "Not long, I promise," came the response. However, Gaara had a feeling that not long would accumulate to a few days. He pushed himself back towards the hole, making sure he could still see the light, but not the bodies. Beyonde Mizukage looked at the woman with a slight frown as she circled around him. Her mint green hair was cut short to her neck and her eyes were a sickening color of gray, they were usually a bright orange. Yugura had held back the bile that had risen in his throat. He also had to hold back the rage that seemed to bubble in his stomach. "You remember this girl, don't you?" A hand clasped on the girl's shoulder and boy who could be no older than him appeared behind her. His hair was blue and vibrant, but his eyes were covered with a mask, a black one. "But it truly is a pleasure to meet the leader of the Bloody Mist." A sickening smile spread on his face as he stepped closer, now side by side with the girl. "What did you do to you?" Yugura growled out. He could tell she wasn't the same Yu he had known. Her mouth was slightly opened, but she had no emotion on her face. Her eyes were dull and gray, they almost looked glazed over. The man seemed bored by his question and frowned. "Do you not care for me? Only this demon?" Yuguru glared hard and went to attack the man. "You." The man spoke and she nodded her head. Before Yugura could even move an inch, Yu had him pinned to the horseshoe table. He thrashed around in obvious discomfort. Of course, with his head being shoved into the table and his arms in a tight grip, it wasn't the best feeling. He knew it was useless to try and talk her out of it because whoever the guy was, he had to be pretty powerful to take control of a Jinchuriki's mind. "What do you want?" He spat out and he guessed because of how disrespectful he said it. Yu shoved his head further into the table. If that was even possible. "You know, you really are a brat." The blue-haired man spoke. "I came all the way over here to give you a proposition and you automatically assume I want something." Shaking his head in mock disappointment, he crossed his arms over his chest. "Will you hear me out?" Igura really had to think for a moment. A proposition, but there must have been a catch. Especially with you being what? Some sign of dominance. Control. A symbol of a threat. He had no clue, but he wasn't liking it a single bit. "Fine." He huffed out. The man seemed eerily excited and abruptly called you off of him. She did so but stayed just a few inches behind him. Her eyes boring in the back of his head, daring to make a move which he did not. The man sat on the horseshoe table Indian style. "I'll help you defeat the man plotting against the Jinchuriki and trying to take control of the Bijuus." Igura felt like snorting. "What the hell are you doing right now?" he shouted, pointing at you with fury. The guy had to be mentally insane for him not to think that he wasn't the one plotting against the Jinchuriki. The blue-haired man shrugged. "I'm displaying the power they could have over 10 of the most powerful people. If I really wanted to, I could make you go ballistic and well, you know the rest." Igura blanched slightly. In only an instant they could take control of any of the Jinchuriki. "But there are only 9 Jinchuriki," he said in a panicked voice. He seriously hoped that no idiot did something irrational like try and create a new Biju with a new Jinchuriki. "That's where your part of the deal will come along," the man said happily as leaned closer to Igura. "I need you to find me the Jinchuriki to the Kyuubi no Kitsune." Igura snorted and placed his arms over his chest. "I wouldn't even know where to start. And what does the Kyuubi have to do with a 10th Jinchuriki?" he complained. "You know just as well as I do that a few days ago one of the tailed beasts suddenly went missing from the group. And all of a sudden the chakra reappears again, but this time it is weaker, just a cage levels, which is oh, so low for a Biju. Something happened and I need to find the brat that holds the Kyuubi. So if you want me to stop the man that practically wants to murder all of you and use the Biju to annihilate all life as we know it, then you would agree." There was an underlying threat in that sentence and Yugura heard it carefully. "Because if you don't, I'll just kill you." Gulping, he nodded his head with a slight scowl on his face as the man patted his head. "Good," he said with a small smile. "Now I shall be going." And with a poof he was gone, leaving Yugura with an unconscious Yu and frazzled thoughts. So many questions filled his mind, but they were all tangled up. Looking down at Yu, he sighed and tried to keep his composure. He struggled to catch his breath as his eyes opened and his heart started to pump blood furiously. Everything was blurry, but he's thankful to be alive. His last resort seemed to work, but he was barely holding on now. "I just have to get her and get out of here," he mumbled to himself. The adventure was just starting for all of them. Simply said, he was not impressed. The body could be used. A body could be switched. In the shinobi world, if you had the skill, then no one could ever know who you were. If you really wanted, you could never exist. Yet it was not the fact that he had controlled the body and taken it over to manipulate and tamper with, it was the fact that he had controlled the girl. "The Jinchuriki no Jinchuriki. Do you normally do things like that?" came the quick and sharp question from his lips as he looked worriedly over at his comrade. The man smiled slyly and shook his head, letting his dark hair also fall into place. No. Was the simple reply as the man walked out, most likely going to get another body for his musings. Orochimaru-sama, the gray-haired boy, thought to himself. Just what are your true plans? He struggled to catch his breath as his eyes opened and his heart started to pump blood furiously. Everything was blurry, but he was thankful to be alive. His last resort seemed to work, but he was barely holding on now. I just have to get her and get out of here, he mumbled to himself. Then we can all be heroes. Naruto shifted on his feet as he looked around at the guards that surrounded the entrance to Sunagakure. He had been to Suna plenty of times, but of course at that time he was on good terms, only there to check in and see how he could help. Now it was like trying two into a Wagakure. They had no idea who he was or the fact that him and Gaara were actually friends. Really good friends, and that Naruto would never think to destroy the village that had helped him more times than he could count. So, what do you suggest, Kurama? Naruto whispered. He wondered how his clone had gotten through the security. They seemed much more heavily guarded. Which was odd since the first time he had gone to Sunagara had been kidnapped. The fox grumbled under his breath, thinking up a good plan. The only way you could actually get inside would be to knock all of them out. But secretly. Naruto frowned at this prospect. It seemed nearly impossible to knock out all those guards without setting off some type of alarm. Of course there was always being discreet and having a plan. Scoping around the entrance for any other things he could take into consideration, he watched closely as the guards on their post talked to each other. Every time he went to Sunagakure he was allowed passage inside, and it seemed as if the guards here in Sunagakure were placed in different shifts. Aomi was placed on the left perimeter instead of the front. Ryu was in Aomi's place when he should have been inside the tunnel checking merchants for. Naruto grinned as he shifted on his feet quietly. Fox, I got an idea. But it involves some of your influence. He said simply. And a group of merchants. The fox was quiet for a moment before Naruto heard a deep chuckle. You are a smart bastard when it comes to this, you know that. Before Naruto could answer, the fox quickly added, but you're an idiot when it comes to everything else. Now, I'm assuming you either want to wait for a bunch of merchants, which I would have no reason in complimenting you if you did, or you want to trick the guards by creating a whole bunch fake merchants that want to get in, and then you sneak in. Grinning even wider, Naruto quickly made the sign for his shadow clone jutsu. It's like you're reading my mind. He quickly made 15 other Narutos pop up. Now switch with me, Fox. Inside of Naruto's mindscape, Kurama sweat dropped seeing that the blonde did not finish his plan all the way. Do you really think that all the Sunagakure guards would be stupid enough to believe that the same blonde wants to just sell stuff in their market? Not to mention 15 10-year-old blondes. Naruto blinked at the statement and quickly slumped his shoulders. Sorry, forgot about that part. I must be too excited. Yeah, too excited. That's what it is. Kushina had everything ready and set up for the dinner. All that she needed was Minato and Kakashi to arrive, and then she'd be set. She also needed the ingredients for dinner. She hadn't gotten them before because she wanted to make them fresh. However, now she was out and about with her son, who was hanging as a ninja, pretending to escort her around. So, what do you need for the dinner? Naruto asked. She looked behind her as they walked past a few markets. The boy had hinged as a man who had long brown hair. His eyes were a beautiful brown with long thick black eyelashes. If Kushina hadn't asked Naruto, she would have thought the boy to be a girl. Ah, just some cucumbers, tuna, mayo, carrots and scallion. Oh. And some seaweed. She said happily. However, the boy looked disgusted, his face twisted with a whole bunch of wrinkles. She frowned at the boy and gave him the look. The look stated that he was to not in any way make faces that questioned, disrespected, and or revolted against anything Kushina liked. And in her case, she liked makizashi. You've never tried it before, have you? Naruto frowned and scratched the back of his head. Never tried what before? Makizashi. She stated as if it was obvious. It's delicious, trust me. However, Naruto looked less than ready to trust her. He simply gave her a wavering smile and nodded. I will definitely try it. He promised. Good, now let's go to the vegetable market. Just the thought of vegetables made Naruto shuddered. And the clone Naruto really had chided himself. He was supposed to be the baddest Haku. There was no way in hell Haku would shudder over some vegetables. So he put on a brave face as they continued onward. Kushina had gotten the carrots and the cucumbers. She was also able to get the seaweed. It was fascinating to the clone Naruto how many people liked his mother. Not that she was a bad person, but she had been the Kyuubi no Kitsune at some point. However, they gladly threw her grins and have a nice days at her. It was like her mother, a saint to the people that she encountered. Just as Kushina was leaving one shop, a woman stopped them. Ah, Kushina-sama. It's nice to see you. What brings you to the markets? Naruto looked over to the woman. First looking down at her hands. They were clasped to another girl's hands. The girl had long brown hair that fell to her shoulder. Her pale eyes looked over at Naruto and Kushina in wonder. Naruto smiled softly at her, something Haku would definitely do, and then looked up to the woman. His breath hitched slightly in his throat as he saw her long midnight blue hair tied up in a traditional style with kazanshi in them. It was truly elegant as the kazanshi matched in colors with her kimono, where the design were all leaves and the stash was pink. Her kazanshi was also pink. Her eyes were lavender pale, and since her lashes were thick and a bold black, it made her eyes stand out even more. Her lips were pink and plump, and her cheeks were a nice tree blossom color also. He had no doubt in his mind he was looking at Hinata's mother. "Ah. Harumi," Kushina said with a brilliant smile. "I haven't seen you in a while. I'm guessing you were out making negotiations. I bet you rocked it." Naruto noticed how the woman visibly blushed. Her eyes darting down to her daughter. "Ah, yes. Thank you, Kushina-sama." Kushina giggled happily, obviously oblivious to Harumi's bashful nature. "Well, what can I say? You are the best negotiator in Konohagakure." "Okage-sama is a great negotiator himself," Harumi said, fidgeting slightly. Naruto watched the altercation in slight amusement. He wondered if this was how it looked like whenever Naruto complimented Hinata. His mother, however, was not as oblivious as his father, though, as she quickly changed the topic. "Oh, I am having everyone over for a clan dinner. Did Hiashi inform you?" "Yes, I would be more than willing to help out in any way that I can," Harumi said, her eyes showing complete determination and kindness. However, Kushina waved her off. "No way. I can't have my guests doing silly work I could do myself. Of course, with Minato's help." "Well, if there is anything you need, don't hesitate to ask," the lavender-eyed woman said before looking down at the small child the clone Naruto knew to be Hanabi. Harumi whispered something in the girl's ear, and quickly the girl smiled up at the two. "I'm Hanabi and I'm 4, I'll be 5 next year," she exclaimed proudly with a huge smile, showing her gaped teeth. The clone Naruto smiled down at her. "Really? My birthday is coming up soon," he said happily. Hanabi looked at him with wide eyes. "My sister's birthday is coming up soon too," she said, and Naruto had to bite his lip a bit at how Hanabi said it with such pride. "They're cute when they're young but turn into brats when they're older. Actually, I can't see Konohamaru being anything but a brat." "Ah yes, Hinata's anniversary is coming up soon," Harumi declared, and Naruto couldn't miss the sad smile that spread on the Hyuga's lips. He looked to his mom momentarily and saw the guilt that was lit on her face so brightly. The clone could only wonder what happened. "I should get going, Kushina-sama. Please tell Hokage-sama I said hi when he returns from his trip." She bowed to both of them and then tugged on Hanabi's hand as they left the shop. As soon as they were gone, Naruto turned to his mother in question. Why did she call Hinata's birthday her anniversary? Kushina looked at him, the guilt on her face seemed to appear even more. In a hushed whisper she said, "Naruto, I got my child back, Harumi's child is gone forever." It was dark out, the moon was split in half, and no stars shone that day. He watched in slight amusement as the rest of his fellow classmen grumbled about it being so dark, but Naruto was happy because he could see the midnight blue sky. "I'm gonna do it," he announced to his friends, who quickly got quiet. They were used to the boy being so determined about any and everything, however on this night they weren't sure what exactly he was trying to do. Getting up and stretching, he looked down at each of his friends who were resting on their backs looking up at the stars. Their parents weren't too far away chatting amongst themselves. He took a look over at his family and back at his friends. "I'm gonna need your guys' help though." Ino was the first to go along with it. She really hated lazing around and she'd rather do something than watch the sky. "Alright," she said, getting up and pulling up Sakura along with her. "We'll do it." Sakura blanched slightly and shook her head. But what are we doing?" she asked to either of her blue-eyed friends. Ino eyed Naruto and guessed she should have asked too. But she was just so bored. "Yeah, Naruto. What exactly do you want us to help you with?" It was Sasuke who spoke, picking at his hair as long strands of grass lay in it. He sat up and looked at the boy with a slight frown. "If it's painting the Hokage monument again, then I want no part. My dad practically had me clean every room in the estate," he said, throwing a glare at his friend. Naruto grinned and took a good look at all his friends. "If any of you aren't in, then you can just leave. I don't want anyone messing up my super awesome plans of becoming an awesome hero." This had Shikamaru open one of his eyes lazily as he looked up at the loud read. Super awesome plan to become a hero? Sounds troublesome. He mumbled to himself, but all his friends knew that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "Will we be looked at as heroes?" Choji asked, munching down on a bag of chips. Choji was the type of person who would want to stay out of trouble for as long as he could, but if it meant a great benefit on his side, he was always up for tagging along. "Of course. Why would I ask if you guys didn't get any credit?" There was a silent duh at the end of that, but it was all playful. His friends knew that he liked to equally share credit, whether it be good or bad. Choji only nodded with a small smile on his face. "I'm in," he sputtered. "Of course, if it means us being heroes." Kiba started as he sat up too. His eyes sparkling with something that looked like hope. "Then me and Akamaru are in." Naruto smiled at the aspiring dog ninja. Alright, how about you, Aiko? Naruto asked the last person who remained laying on the ground. Well, actually Shikamaru was laying on the ground too, but he already agreed. A soft snore was heard and Naruto's sweat dropped. Picking up his foot, Naruto gave a swift effective kick to the boy's side, making him roll down the slope hill. What the heck was that for? Aiko yelled as he marched back up the hill. His eyes were droopy, but his brow was creased in a fierce line. Naruto chuckled to himself as the Uchiha finally made it to the top and sat beside Kiba. I asked you a question. He stated with a shrug. Aiko looked at him with slight disbelief and then looked around at Sakura and Ino, who were snickering at him. Kiba was cackling and Sasuke just held a smirk while Shikamaru frowned. Naruto wants to make us heroes. Are you in? Sasuke asked. Of course I'm in. What type of question is that? Aiko smirked as they all stood on their feet. So how do we become heroes? He asked, his tired facade slipping away quickly. Naruto grinned widely and shifted on the ground as he looked up at the sky. Well, let's just say it involves the tale of Konoha's Hyuga princess. Shikamaru lay in the grass looking up at the stars. News had come in that the Hokage had returned and he hadn't been clear on what exactly happened. It was never really good when a Hokage didn't quickly announce what had gone on at a summit. He only hoped that he didn't have to go through war like his father had. It seemed troublesome. Do you remember when we lay here 2 years ago? Ino asked. Her voice was hushed and held an undertone of sadness. Shikamaru did remember very clearly, as if it was just yesterday. I remember he told us we all were gonna be heroes. Choji said, and Shikamaru could just hear that the boy was already getting emotional. If only we didn't nothing. Kiba exclaimed, sitting up suddenly. Naruto wouldn't want us to blame ourselves. He said with a nod of his head. Doesn't mean we can't blame ourselves. Sakura said, dully, turning to her side, her eyes looking widely over the stars. Seriously, are we sulking right now? Ino asked, standing to her feet. Look, I'm sorry for bringing the whole thing up to begin with. Besides, it's his anniversary soon. What are we going to do for this anniversary? She asked. Her blonde locks falling on her face. Isn't Kushina-sama and Hokage-sama inviting all the clan heads for a dinner on his birthday? Shino chimed in. Shikamaru almost forgot he was around. Yeah, Jiraiya-sama says it has something to do with Hokage-sama coming back. Aiko intoned. Wait, Jiraiya-sama came back? Sakura shot up from her laying spot on the grass. When? A few days ago. Aiko shrugged. Sasuke watched his cousin closely. It was seriously bugging Sasuke that the enthusiastic Uchiha wasn't, well, enthusiastic. His smile seemed to be forced now, and he never talked as much as he used to. It was seriously bothering Sasuke. What are you planning? He asked bluntly. His eyes scanning Aiko's for anything. Aiko looked at him dully and shrugged. I don't think they found anything, Sasuke. Aiko said softly, not including the others in his conversation. Sasuke glared harshly at his cousin. It's all we got left, Aiko. What exactly will you do if it turns up as nothing? But instantly he regretted asking, as a smirk so mischievous and so desperate spread on Aiko's lips. Do what we've been told never to do as Uchiha. He said simply. And what would that be? Sasuke asked, truly curious. His father always told him to never give up the Uchiha greatest secret, but even he didn't know the Uchiha's greatest secret. Don't do drastic things based on your emotions. Sasuke frowned at this, taking a good look at cousin, as the boy was pulled into the conversation with Sakura and Ino, as they talked excitedly about what Jiraiya-sama and Obito-sama must have found. Sasuke watched as the boy played along, smiling widely and giving his nod of approval to some ideas. What exactly do you plan on doing if nothing shows up, Aiko? Naruto happily smirked at all the clones he had made. He soon demanded them to hinge into someone else, preferably some type of marketer. They all did, and each of them had their own item to sell. Of course, the item was a twig or leaf, also hinged to look like something else. He felt a swell of pride in his chest. Although he was a Hokage, it didn't mean that his mind didn't lack the childish thoughts of pranking every now and then. This would be the ultimate prank. But it was for a good purpose. Why not kill two birds with one stone? Naruto held up a net of fish he had caught by the sea. He was more than sure it was illegal to use explosive tags to catch fish, but it was for a good cause. Now all he needed was for Kuruma to switch with him, and then they'd be marching up to gates of Sunagakure. However, the fox was very hesitant. I have a bad feeling about this whole thing, Kit the fox grumbled, and Naruto was surprised by this. The fox had a bad feeling about something. What spurred that on? What bad feeling are you having? Naruto questioned as he played with different hinges, seeing which would work best. He opted for someone burly and with a mustache, but Naruto had to think of someone he knew that actually looked like that. The best he got was Iro-sennin, and then he altered him a bit. He then practiced his pervy smile. For some reason it felt necessary. I haven't felt this feeling since the day your father sealed me inside you. So take it as a warning. I have no idea what it is, but it is familiar almost like it's. Naruto smiled widely and sadistically into the river and then shivered. It was perfect. What is it like? He questioned, gathering the clones around for their entry. The fox was hesitant to answer, which made Naruto worry a bit. It couldn't possibly be true, so do not worry. And with that the fox retreated. Naruto contemplated his words a bit, wondering what couldn't be true, but didn't dwell on it too long, since they had Gaara to save, who was probably starving right about now. Well, it won't change the fact that you will have to talk to the guard. Naruto reminded and heard Kurama curse him about how no human would ever tell him what to do. Naruto rolled his eyes. It's either that or have all Suna chase us, because I don't have scary as hell eyes that can convince people to do whatever the hell I want. It's only the weak-minded kid. I never had a chance to improve on it. Kurama mumbled, but nonetheless he switched with the brat. Let's get it over with.